Chapter 1. The Teacher's Concern. The crack of gnarled wood against flesh had been echoing across the Smeltings Academy courtyard for the better part of 20 minutes, and James Richardson was beginning to feel queasy. He stood at his classroom window, watching the traditional afternoon practice unfold on the cobblestones below. The summer term of 1989 was drawing to a close, and the boys were making the most of the warm July weather. Their maroon tailcoats hung abandoned on benches while they circled each other in their orange knickerbockers, straw boaters askew, wielding their ceremonial canes with the enthusiasm that had characterized English public school education for centuries. What unsettled Richardson wasn't the practice itself. He'd attended Smeltings himself 20 years ago, had felt the sting of those same gnarled sticks across his own knuckles. It was supposed to build character, prepare young men for the harsh realities of adulthood. The headmaster had explained it to him during his interview 2 years ago. A bit of rough play never killed anyone, Richardson. Toughens them up for the real world. No, what made Richardson's stomach turn was the particular gleam in Dudley Dursley's eyes as he brought his cane down across Timothy Pemberton's shoulder with a resounding thwack. The boy was enjoying it too much. Richardson had been teaching at Smeltings Academy for 2 years now, long enough to recognize the difference between the ritualistic aggression that the school encouraged and something altogether more troubling. Most boys wielded their canes with theatrical bravado, playing at being men, testing boundaries. They might swing harder than necessary, might relish a particularly satisfying strike, but underneath it all lay a fundamental understanding that this was still, essentially, play. Dudley Dursley played differently. The 10-year-old boy moved with a methodical precision that reminded Richardson uncomfortably of the documentaries he'd watched about animal behavior. There was no wild swinging, no shouted challenges or good-natured taunts. Instead, Dudley studied his opponents with cold calculation, waiting for openings, striking with measured force designed to inflict maximum discomfort without crossing the line into outright assault. "Take that, you little freak," Dudley muttered, as his cane connected with young Pemberton's ribs. The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but Richardson's classroom window was open, and he caught them clearly. "That's what freaks get when they don't know their place." Timothy Pemberton staggered backward, clutching his side, tears gathering in his eyes. He was a slight boy, bookish and anxious, precisely the sort who typically found himself on the wrong end of Smelting's character-building traditions. But the other boys were beginning to look uncomfortable. Even Malcolm Henley, who had never met a fight he couldn't start, was shifting uneasily as he watched Dudley advance on the wounded Pemberton. "I say, Dursley," Malcolm called out, his voice carrying a note of uncertain authority. "Perhaps that's enough for one afternoon?" Dudley turned toward Malcolm, and Richardson felt his breath catch at the expression on the boy's face. It was blank, almost serene, but something cold and calculating lurked behind those pale eyes. For a moment, Richardson thought Dudley might turn his cane on Malcolm instead. Then the moment passed, and Dudley's features rearranged themselves into something approaching normalcy. "Of course," Dudley said agreeably. "Wouldn't want to hurt anybody." The words should have been reassuring. Instead, they made Richardson's skin crawl. He turned away from the window, settling behind his desk with a stack of essays that needed grading. Dudley Dursley's work lay on top, and Richardson found himself staring at the boy's neat, careful handwriting with growing unease. The assignment had been straightforward enough. Describe the structure of a proper British household and the roles of each family member. Most of the boys had produced predictable screeds about fathers who worked and mothers who managed domestic affairs, with themselves cast as future inheritors of masculine authority. Nothing particularly insightful, but nothing concerning either. Dudley's essay was different. A proper household requires clear hierarchy, the boy had written. The head of house must maintain discipline over all members, particularly those who might disrupt family harmony. Some family members are naturally superior to others, and it is important that this superiority be acknowledged by all parties. Those who refuse to acknowledge their place in the natural order must be corrected firmly until they learn proper respect. Richardson read the passage again, his frown deepening. The language was too sophisticated for a 10-year-old, too calculated. He could almost hear Vernon Dursley's voice in the careful phrasing, could picture the man lecturing his son about natural hierarchy and proper respect. But what troubled Richardson most was what came next. "In my own household," Dudley continued, "we have learned the importance of keeping disruptive elements in their proper place. My cousin is a perfect example of how firm discipline can correct problematic behavior. When he first came to live with us, he did not understand his position in our family structure. Now he knows better. He sleeps where he belongs, does the work that is appropriate for someone of his station, and rarely causes trouble anymore." This demonstrates that even the most difficult family members can be properly managed with consistent correction. Richardson set the essay down, his hands not quite steady. In 2 years of teaching at Smeltings, he had encountered his share of troubled children. Boys from broken homes, boys carrying the weight of family expectations they could never meet, boys acting out in response to pressures they couldn't articulate. He had learned to read between the lines of their essays, to recognize the signs of distress hidden behind boarding school bravado. This was something else, entirely. The careful language, the casual reference to keeping disruptive elements in their proper place, the matter-of-fact description of a family member being taught to know better. It all painted a picture that made Richardson profoundly uncomfortable. And the boy had mentioned a cousin who sleeps where he belongs and does the work that is appropriate for someone of his station. Richardson pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, his movements deliberate and careful. He had attended enough faculty meetings, had sat through enough discussions about the school's responsibility to its students to know that Smeltings Academy preferred to handle such matters internally. The headmaster had made it clear that external authorities were to be involved only in the most extreme circumstances, and then only after thorough consultation with the school board. But Richardson had also completed his teaching certification just 2 years ago, had sat through lectures on recognizing signs of abuse and neglect. The education department was taking such matters more seriously these days, particularly after several highly publicized cases had revealed the inadequacy of previous reporting procedures. "Incident report," he wrote at the top of the page. "Student, Dudley Dursley, Form 3. Date, July 15th, 1989. He paused, considering his words carefully. What he wrote here could have serious consequences, both for the Dursley family and for his own position at Smeltings. The school valued discretion above almost everything else. Parents paid substantial fees, partly for the assurance that their children's difficulties would be handled quietly, without the messy intrusion of outside authorities. But Richardson found himself thinking about the cousin Dudley had mentioned, the family member who had been corrected until he learned his proper place. He thought about the cold calculation in Dudley's eyes as he'd struck Timothy Pemberton, the casual cruelty in his voice as he'd called the smaller boy a freak. During outdoor practice session, Richardson continued writing, student demonstrated concerning level of aggression toward younger classmate. Behavior appeared systematic rather than spontaneous, suggesting learned patterns rather than typical boyish roughhousing. Of greater concern is content of recent essay assignment, which contains troubling references to domestic discipline and family hierarchy. He detailed Dudley's essay, quoting the most concerning passages verbatim, Then he added the observations that had been accumulating over the past term. Dudley's casual references to physical punishment at home, his matter-of-fact descriptions of a cousin who was apparently subjected to different treatment than other family members, his lack of empathy when discussing suffering, whether of classmates or family. Student has made repeated references to a cousin residing in the household, Richardson wrote. Descriptions suggest this child may be subjected to differential treatment, including restriction of movement, sleeps where he belongs, and assignment of domestic labor, inappropriate for a child. Does the work that is appropriate for someone of his station. Students' language and attitude suggest these conditions are normalized within the household. Richardson paused again, his pen hovering over the page. He was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Once he filed this report, once it entered the educational authorities' system, it would take on a life of its own. Social services would become involved. The Dursley household would be subjected to scrutiny that might well tear it apart. But he found himself thinking about that unnamed cousin again, wondering what sleeping where he belongs might mean in practice, wondering what sort of work was considered appropriate for a child who had supposedly disrupted family harmony. Recommendation, he wrote finally. Request immediate welfare check of household, with particular attention to well-being of minor child identified as cousin in students' essays. Based on students' descriptions and observed behavior patterns, there is reasonable concern for child's safety and appropriate care. At the bottom of the page, he added the Dursley family address, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, and the child's name, which Dudley had mentioned in passing during previous assignments, Harry Potter. Richardson sealed the report in an envelope and addressed it to Surrey County Council's Child Protection Services. He would post it on his way home this evening, ensuring it would reach the proper authorities within days. As he tucked the envelope into his briefcase, Richardson caught sight of Dudley Dursley through his classroom window again. The boy was walking across the courtyard now, his gnarled cane swinging casually at his side, his expression placid and satisfied. He looked like any other smelting student heading home for the summer holidays. But Richardson knew better. And soon, he hoped, someone else would too. Chapter 2. Sarah Williams. Investigates Sarah Williams could have sworn the stack of case files on her desk had grown taller overnight. She stood in the doorway of her cramped office on the 3rd floor of Surrey County Council's Social Services building, clutching her morning coffee and staring at the manila folders that seemed to multiply like some particularly malevolent species of fungi. The fluorescent light overhead flickered intermittently, casting irregular shadows across the chaos that had become her professional life since joining the department 6 months ago. 26 years old and armed with a fresh degree in social work from the University of Surrey, Sarah had entered the field with the naive optimism that characterized most recent graduates. She was going to make a difference. She was going to protect children who couldn't protect themselves. She was going to navigate the complex intersection of family dynamics, legal requirements, and bureaucratic procedure with grace and efficiency. 6 months later, she was drowning. The backlog clearing initiative had sounded reasonable enough when her supervisor, Margaret Thornton, had explained it during Sarah's orientation. Surrey County Council was finally addressing the crisis that had been building for years. Over 800 unallocated cases sitting in filing cabinets, while overworked social workers struggled to manage impossible caseloads. The government was providing additional funding, hiring new staff, and implementing new procedures designed to ensure that no child in need slipped through the cracks. In practice, it meant that Sarah and her fellow junior social workers were processing cases at a rate that left little time for anything resembling thorough investigation. Review the file, make the assessment, close the case, or escalate as appropriate. Repeat until the stack disappeared. Sarah settled behind her desk, pushing aside a half-eaten sandwich from yesterday's lunch and reached for the top file. The label read, Dursley Dudley, Educational Concern Report, Priority 2. She flipped it open, expecting another routine matter. A child acting out at school, parents who needed guidance on behavior management, perhaps a referral to family counseling services. Instead, she found herself reading James Richardson's meticulously detailed report with growing alarm. The teacher's observations were precise and troubling. Sarah had read enough case files to recognize the difference between a teacher making a mountain out of a molehill and one who had genuinely identified cause for concern. Richardson's language was careful, professional, devoid of the emotional hyperbole that sometimes characterized reports from educators who were simply frustrated with difficult students. More importantly, his focus wasn't really on Dudley Dursley at all. Sarah read through Richardson's description of the boy's essay twice, her frown deepening with each pass. The casual references to keeping disruptive elements in their proper place, the matter-of-fact discussion of a family member who had been corrected until he learned appropriate subservience. It painted a picture that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. But it was Richardson's concluding paragraph that made her reach for her telephone directory. Student has made repeated references to a cousin residing in the household, she read aloud to herself. Descriptions suggest this child may be subjected to differential treatment, including restriction of movement and assignment of domestic labor inappropriate for a child. Recommendation: immediate welfare check with particular attention to well-being of Harry Potter. Harry Potter. Sarah pulled out a notepad and wrote the name at the top of a fresh page, underlining it twice. She added the address, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, and the approximate age, which she estimated at 9 based on Richardson's timeline. Then she reached for her telephone. Surrey Education Authority, Records Department. Janet speaking. Good morning, Janet. This is Sarah Williams from Child Protection Services. I'm following up on an educational concern report, and I need to verify enrollment records for a child. Of course, love. What's the name and date of birth? Harry Potter. I don't have an exact date of birth, but he should be approximately 9 years old. Last known address is 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging. Sarah heard the clicking of computer keys, followed by a pause that stretched longer than it should have. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that name? Potter. P-O-T-T-E-R. First name Harry. More clicking. Another pause. I'm not finding any enrollment records for a Harry Potter at any primary school in the Surrey system. Are you certain about the spelling? Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. What about private schools? Independent institutions? I can check the registered private schools, but that would be a bit unusual. Most families in Little Whinging use the local primary. Hold on. More typing. No, nothing in the private system either. No record of a Harry Potter anywhere in Surrey education records. What about transfers? Children who might have been enrolled elsewhere and moved to the area. The system should show transfer records if there were any. I'm not seeing anything. Is it possible this child has never been enrolled in formal education? Sarah thanked Janet and hung up, staring at the name she'd written on her notepad. In 1989, formal education was mandatory for all children between the ages of 5 and 16. There were exceptions: children with severe disabilities who received alternative education, families who had registered for approved homeschooling programs, but such exceptions required extensive documentation and regular oversight. She picked up the phone again. Surrey Home Education Authority. This is David. This is Sarah Williams, Child Protection Services. I'm trying to locate records for a child who doesn't appear in the standard school system. Harry Potter, approximately 9 years old, residing at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging. Let me check our home education registrations. No, I don't see any Potter family registered with our department. If they're providing home education without registration, that would be a violation of the Education Act. Sarah made a note. No educational provision. potential violation. Then she dialed a third number. Dr. Henderson's surgery. Karen speaking. Good morning. This is Sarah Williams from Child Protection Services. I'm conducting a welfare check, and I need to verify medical records for a child in your catchment area. Harry Potter, approximately 9 years old. 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging. I'll need to check with Dr. Henderson about releasing any information, but let me see if we have records first. Potter, you said? Potter. That's correct. I'm not finding any patient records for a Harry Potter. We do have records for the Dursley family at that address, Vernon, Petunia, and Dudley, but no additional children registered. Sarah set down her phone with deliberate care. 3 separate government systems, education, home education oversight, and National Health Service registration, and not one of them contained any evidence that Harry Potter existed. But James Richardson's report suggested otherwise. A child who lived at 4 Privet Drive, a child who slept where he belonged and performed domestic labor, a child who had been systematically corrected until he learned his place in the household hierarchy, a child who had somehow been rendered invisible to every official system designed to protect him. Sarah pulled out the standard Child Protection Assessment form and began filling in the preliminary sections. Under presenting concerns, she wrote, "Child possibly living in household with no access to education, medical care, or official recognition. Potential victim of systematic abuse and neglect. Complete absence from government systems suggests deliberate concealment." Under risk factors, she added, isolation from external oversight, apparent normalization of child's subordinate status within household. Evidence suggests long-term pattern of control and discipline. Child may be unaware of rights or available protections. The assessment protocol was clear. Cases involving complete absence from educational and medical systems required immediate home visit within 48 hours. Sarah glanced at her calendar. Today was Wednesday, July 19th. She could schedule the visit for Friday morning, allowing time to review any additional information and prepare appropriate intervention strategies. She picked up her phone one final time. "Margaret, it's Sarah. I've got a case that needs priority attention. Possible child concealment situation in Little Whinging." No, I'm not exaggerating. 9-year-old child with no educational enrollment, no medical registration, no official recognition anywhere in the system. Yes, I understand the implications. I'm scheduling an unannounced home visit for Friday morning. Sarah hung up and leaned back in her chair, staring at Richardson's report. In her 6 months with Surrey County Council, she had encountered families who neglected their children's education, parents who avoided medical care due to religious beliefs or financial concerns, children who fell through bureaucratic cracks due to frequent moves or family instability. She had never encountered a child who appeared to have been systematically erased from official existence while living in the heart of suburban Surrey. But Richardson's careful observations suggested that Harry Potter wasn't just neglected. He was controlled, kept in his place through what Dudley Dursley had described as firm discipline and consistent correction. The language was too sophisticated for a 10-year-old, which meant it was probably being modeled by the adults in the household, adults who had somehow managed to hide a child's existence for nearly a decade. Sarah gathered Richardson's report, her assessment forms, and a standard home visit protocol checklist. She would spend the rest of the day preparing for Friday's visit, reviewing guidelines for cases involving potential severe neglect, and familiarizing herself with emergency intervention procedures. Because if Harry Potter was real, if he was living the life that Richardson's report suggested, then Friday morning might be the first opportunity anyone had given him to escape it. And Sarah Williams was not going to let that opportunity slip away. Chapter 3. The Home Visit Revelation. The morning air on Privet Drive carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and the quiet satisfaction of suburban routine, but Sarah Williams felt her nerves tightening with each step toward number 4. It was just past 9 o'clock on Friday morning, July 21st, and the street hummed with the gentle bustle of middle-class domesticity. Women in floral dresses tended to their front gardens, while children played hopscotch on perfectly maintained pavements. The Dursley house stood out even among its well-kept neighbours. The brass door knocker gleamed, the windows sparkled, and every blade of grass appeared to have been trimmed to regulation height. Sarah clutched her clipboard and official identification, her stomach churning with the familiar mixture of determination and dread that preceded difficult home visits. In her 2 days of preparation, she had reviewed every protocol for cases involving potential severe neglect, had practiced the careful balance of authority and empathy that such situations required, but nothing in her training had quite prepared her for a child who existed in complete official invisibility. The woman who answered her knock was precisely what Sarah had expected from the address and neighbourhood, well-groomed, carefully dressed, with the sort of rigid posture that suggested a life spent maintaining appearances. Petunia Dursley stood in her doorway, wearing a pale yellow dress that matched the morning sunshine, her blonde hair styled in the sort of elaborate waves that required significant daily maintenance. What Sarah hadn't expected was the way the woman's face drained of colour when she presented her identification. "Mrs. Dursley, I'm Sarah Williams from Surrey County Council, Child Protection Services. I'm following up on some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding a child in this household." There must be some mistake," Petunia stammered, her voice rising half an octave. I don't understand what concerns you could possibly. May I come in, please? This is just a routine welfare check, but I do need to speak with you about Harry Potter. The name hit Petunia like a physical blow. She swayed slightly, gripping the doorframe with white-knuckled fingers, and for a moment Sarah wondered if the woman might actually faint. When Petunia finally stepped aside to allow her entry, she moved with the mechanical stiffness of someone operating purely on autopilot. The interior of number 4 was as immaculate as its exterior suggested. The sitting room featured cream-coloured furniture arranged with mathematical precision, family photographs displayed at perfect angles, and not a single item out of place. It was the sort of house that belonged in a magazine spread about proper British domestic life. "Where is Harry now?" Sarah asked, settling onto the edge of an armchair and opening her notepad. He's upstairs, cleaning. He helps with household chores during the school holidays." Sarah made a note. Child performing domestic labour during summer break. Then she looked up at Petunia, who remained standing near the doorway, as if preparing to flee. "Mrs. Dursley, our records show that Harry is not enrolled in any school in the Surrey system. Can you explain why a 9-year-old child in your care is not receiving formal education?" "School." Petunia's voice cracked slightly. We've been providing education at home, private tutoring. Very expensive, but we believe in giving children proper attention." "I see. And which approved home education program are you registered with?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Petunia's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her eyes darting toward the stairs as if expecting rescue from that direction. "Mrs. Dursley, I'm going to need to speak with Harry directly. Could you please ask him to come down?" He's busy just now, and he doesn't. Children can be so shy with strangers, you understand. Perhaps if you came back another time, when my husband could be here." "I'm afraid this can't wait." Sarah stood, her training taking over as she recognized the classic deflection tactics of parents, trying to conceal abuse. "I need to see Harry now. Please." Petunia's composure cracked entirely. "You can't just come in here making demands. This is our home. We're a respectable family. We've never—" "Mrs. Dursley." Sarah's voice carried the quiet authority she'd learned to project in crisis situations. "I can see Harry with your cooperation, or I can return with police assistance and a court order. But I will see him today." "Where is he?" The sound that emerged from Petunia was somewhere between a whimper and a snarl. She gestured helplessly toward the hallway, her carefully maintained facade collapsing into something raw and desperate. "He's under the stairs. His room is under the stairs. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "Under the stairs," Petunia whispered. "It's perfectly adequate, really. Children don't need much space, and he's always been quite small." Sarah was already moving toward the hallway, her professional composure barely containing the rage that threatened to overwhelm her. She found the door easily enough, a narrow wooden panel tucked beneath the staircase, secured with not one, but 3 heavy deadbolts. The locks were positioned on the outside. "Open it," she said. Petunia's hands shook as she fumbled with the bolts. The metallic scraping of their release seemed to echo through the pristine house like a condemnation. When the door finally swung open, Sarah had to bite back, an involuntary gasp. The space under the stairs was perhaps 6 feet long and 4 feet wide at its deepest point, narrowing to nothing as the staircase angled downward. A thin, stained mattress lay on the floor beside a collection of broken toys and a single change of clothes. Spiders had claimed the corners, their webs thick with dust and the small corpses of their prey. The air inside carried the stale scent of confinement and unwashed bodies, and curled on the mattress, blinking up at her with enormous green eyes, was the thinnest child Sarah had ever seen. Harry Potter looked far younger than his 9 years. His black hair hung in limp strands around a face that was all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, his skin carrying the pallor of someone who spent too little time outdoors. But it was his eyes that made Sarah's heart clench. Ancient, wary, filled with the sort of careful calculation that no child should need to master. "Hello," she said softly, crouching down to bring herself to his eye level. "I'm Sarah. I'm here to help." Harry's gaze flicked from Sarah to Petunia and back again, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Am I in trouble?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Here was a child who had been locked in a cupboard, starved to the point of severe malnutrition, and his first concern was whether he had somehow done something wrong. "No, sweetheart, you're not in trouble. Can you come out here so we can talk properly?" Harry glanced at Petunia again, some silent communication passing between them. Then he crawled out of the cupboard with movements that were careful and practiced, as if he'd performed this action countless times before. Standing, he barely reached Sarah's shoulder, and she could see the way his clothes hung on his skeletal frame like fabric draped over a coat hanger. "Harry," she said gently, "can you tell me about your room?" "It's not really a room," Harry said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "It's the cupboard. But it's mine. Aunt Petunia says I should be grateful to have anywhere at all." Sarah made careful notes, her handwriting steady despite the fury building in her chest. "And how long have you been sleeping in the cupboard?" "Always," Harry said simply. "Since I came here. Aunt Petunia says it's where I belong." "When was the last time you saw a doctor?" Harry's brow furrowed, as if the question made no sense. "I don't know what that is." Sarah looked at Petunia, who had backed against the wall and was wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to physically hold her world together. "Mrs. Dursley, this child has never received medical care." "He's never been sick," Petunia said quickly. "Children are resilient, you know. He's perfectly fine. A bit thin, perhaps, but some children are naturally malnourished?" Sarah's professional composure finally cracked. "Mrs. Dursley, this child is severely underweight. He's showing clear signs of chronic nutritional deficiency. And you've had him locked in a cupboard under your stairs?" "It's not locked," Petunia protested weakly. "There are 3 deadbolts on the outside of that door. Those are for security. To keep him safe at night." "Safe from what?" Petunia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Before she could attempt another fabrication, the front door slammed open with enough force to rattle the pictures on the walls. "What the hell is going on here?" Vernon Dursley's voice boomed through the house like thunder. He filled the doorway to the sitting room, his massive frame radiating the sort of aggressive authority that smaller men often cultivated to compensate for deeper insecurities. His small eyes fixed on Sarah with immediate hostility. "Mr. Dursley," Sarah said, rising to her full height and stepping slightly in front of Harry. "I'm Sarah Williams from Child Protection Services. I'm conducting a welfare check on Harry Potter." Vernon's face, already flushed from his hurried return from work, turned an alarming shade of purple. "Potter," he spat. "That little freak has been nothing but trouble from the day he arrived. What lies has he been telling?" "Mr. Dursley, Harry hasn't told me anything. I'm here because of concerns raised by his cousin's school about potential abuse in this household." "Abuse?" Vernon's voice rose to a roar. "We've fed that ungrateful brat, clothed him, given him a roof over his head for 9 years. And this is the thanks we get? Some interfering government busybody coming into our home, making accusations." "I've seen his living conditions," Sarah said quietly. "A cupboard under the stairs with deadbolts on the outside, severe malnutrition, no educational provision, no medical care. Mr. Dursley, I'm declaring this an immediate child protection concern." Vernon took a step toward her, his massive hands clenching into fists. "You can't just come in here and— Actually, I can." Sarah pulled out her identification again, this time displaying it prominently. "And I'm going to be calling police and medical services immediately. Harry will be removed from this house today, pending a full investigation." Behind her, she heard Harry's sharp intake of breath. When she turned, she saw him staring at her with an expression of wonder mixed with terror, as if she'd just promised him something too miraculous to believe. "Really?" he whispered. Sarah knelt down beside him, ignoring Vernon's continued ranting and Petunia's quiet sobbing. "Really?" she said firmly. "You're going to be safe now, Harry, I promise." And as she reached for her phone to begin the calls that would change everything, Sarah Williams realized she was about to set in motion something that would challenge far more than just one family's terrible secrets. Chapter 4. Emergency Placement Protocol. The next 3 hours passed in a whirlwind of official procedures that left Harry feeling as though he'd been caught in some impossible dream. Sarah Williams had stepped into the Dursleys' garden to make her phone calls, speaking in the crisp, professional tones that Harry was beginning to recognize as the voice of someone who knew how to make things happen. Through the sitting room window, he could see her pacing across the perfectly manicured lawn, her notepad balanced in one hand while she gestured with the other. Each conversation seemed to add another layer of urgency to her movements. Inside the house, Vernon had retreated to his armchair, where he sat in rigid silence, his massive hands gripping the armrests with enough force to leave permanent impressions in the fabric. Petunia had taken refuge in the kitchen, where the sounds of frantic cleaning suggested she was attempting to scrub away the morning's revelations through sheer force of domestic routine. Harry remained where Sarah had left him, standing in the hallway near his cupboard door, uncertain whether he was allowed to move without permission. In 9 years of living at Privet Drive, he had learned that the safest response to adult conflicts was to become as invisible as possible until someone told him what to do. But this felt different. This felt like something was actually changing. "Harry!" Sarah appeared in the doorway, slipping her phone back into a briefcase. "I've called for police assistance and medical services. They'll be here shortly to help us sort everything out. How are you feeling?" The question caught him off guard. Adults didn't typically ask Harry how he was feeling about anything. They told him what to feel, or more commonly, told him to stop feeling whatever inconvenient emotion was making their lives more difficult. "I don't know," he answered honestly. Sarah knelt down beside him, her expression gentle but serious. "That's perfectly normal, sweetheart. A lot of things are going to change today, and change can be scary even when it's good change. But I want you to know that everything we're doing is to keep you safe, all right?" Harry nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he understood what safe meant in practical terms. Safe from what? Safe to do what? His understanding of safety was largely negative. Moments when Vernon wasn't angry, when Petunia wasn't finding fault with his existence, when Dudley was occupied with activities that didn't involve using Harry as a target. The sound of vehicles pulling up outside sent Vernon surging to his feet with a snarl of rage. "You've called the police? On us? We're respectable people. We've never so much as had a parking ticket." "Mr. Dursley, please sit down," Sarah said, without looking at him. Her attention remained focused on Harry, who had instinctively stepped backward at Vernon's sudden movement. "You're frightening, Harry." "Frightening him? I'll show you frightening." "Mr. Dursley." Sarah's voice carried a new edge of steel. "If you take one step closer to this child, I will have you arrested for intimidation of a witness. Sit down." The arrival of Constable Jenkins and Dr. Margaret Hartwell shifted the atmosphere in the house from tense confrontation to official procedure. Jenkins was a soft-spoken man with greying hair who seemed to specialize in situations involving children, while Dr. Hartwell carried herself with the sort of calm competence that immediately inspired confidence. "Hello, Harry," Dr. Hartwell said, settling onto the sofa at his eye level. "I'm a doctor, which means my job is to help people feel better when they're hurt or sick. Sarah tells me you might need a bit of looking after. Would that be all right with you?" Harry glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. Dr. Hartwell's examination took place in the Dursleys' pristine sitting room, with Sarah and Constable Jenkins present as witnesses. The doctor's hands were gentle as she checked Harry's eyes, ears, and throat, but her expression grew increasingly grim as the examination progressed. "Severe malnutrition," she murmured to Sarah, her voice pitched low enough that Harry couldn't quite make out all the words. "Multiple healed fractures in the ribs, consistent with repeated blunt trauma. Dental neglect. And this scarring on his forehead." Harry touched the lightning bolt-shaped scar automatically. "I got that in the car crash," he said, "when my parents died." Dr. Hartwell's examination paused. "Car crash? Harry, this type of scarring isn't consistent with automobile accident injuries. It looks more like a burn of some kind." "That's what Aunt Petunia told me," Harry said uncertainly. "She said they died in a car crash because my dad was drunk." Sarah and Dr. Hartwell exchanged a look that Harry couldn't interpret. Then Dr. Hartwell continued her examination, her movements becoming even more careful as she documented each sign of neglect and abuse. "Harry," she said finally, "you're going to need to come with me to the hospital for some proper tests. Nothing scary, just making sure you're healthy. And Sarah has arranged for you to stay with a very nice family tonight, instead of sleeping in that cupboard." "How does that sound?" Harry stared at her. "I don't have to go back to the cupboard?" "No, sweetheart. You never have to sleep in that cupboard again." The words hit Harry like a physical sensation, something warm and impossible spreading through his chest. He had never imagined that anyone could simply decide he didn't have to live in the cupboard anymore. It seemed like the sort of magic that only happened in the stories he sometimes overheard other children talking about at the grocery store. The Chen family lived on Willow Lane, a quiet street 15 minutes from Privet Drive, where the houses were smaller, but somehow more welcoming than their little whinging counterparts. Patricia Chen answered their door wearing a flour-dusted apron and a smile that immediately made Harry feel as though he'd been warmed by unexpected sunshine. "You must be Harry," she said, crouching down to his level just as Sarah had done. "I'm Patricia, but you can call me Mrs. Chen or Pat, whatever feels comfortable. David and I are so glad you're going to be staying with us." David Chen appeared behind his wife, a tall man with kind eyes and paint-stained fingers who worked, Sarah had explained, as an art teacher at the local secondary school. Their house smelled like fresh bread and coffee, scents that seemed to wrap around Harry like a blanket. "We've set up the spare room for you," Patricia said, leading Harry up a narrow staircase. "It's not very big, but it has a proper window and a bed and a wardrobe for your things." She opened the door to reveal a small but cheerful room with yellow walls and white curtains. A single bed sat against one wall, made up with blue sheets and a thick duvet. There was a wooden desk beneath the window, a small wardrobe in the corner, and, most wonderfully, a bookshelf filled with what appeared to be actual books. Harry stood in the doorway, afraid that moving would somehow break the spell and reveal this to be another of the vivid dreams that sometimes visited him in his cupboard. Beds were for people like Dudley, people who mattered enough to deserve comfort and privacy. Harry slept on a thin mattress in a space barely large enough for his body, surrounded by spiders and the constant awareness that he could be locked in at any moment. "Is this really for me?" he whispered. "Really and truly," Patricia said, and her voice carried such gentle certainty that Harry found himself believing her. "And Harry, you don't need permission to be here. This is your room, for as long as you need it." That evening, as Harry sat at the Chen family's kitchen table eating his second bowl of homemade soup, he kept waiting for someone to tell him he'd had enough, or to demand that he wash the dishes to earn his meal, or to explain what chores he would need to complete to justify taking up space in their home. Instead, David asked him about his favorite subjects in school, seemingly untroubled when Harry explained that he'd never attended school. Patricia offered him a third bowl of soup with the same casual warmth she'd shown in offering the second. Their teenage daughter Emma, home from a friend's house, chatted about her summer holiday plans, as though Harry's presence at their table was the most natural thing in the world. When bedtime came, Patricia showed him to the bathroom and provided him with a new toothbrush, toothpaste, and a pair of pajamas that actually fit his small frame. The pajamas were soft cotton, printed with tiny airplanes, clearly purchased specifically for him, rather than handed down from someone who no longer wanted them. "Sleep well, Harry," Patricia said, tucking the duvet around him with practiced motherly efficiency. "If you need anything during the night, water, another blanket, or if you just feel scared, our room is just across the hall, all right?" Harry nodded, though he couldn't imagine circumstances under which he would dare to wake adults for something as trivial as his own comfort. Patricia seemed to understand his hesitation. "I mean it," she said seriously. "Anything at all. That's what families do. We take care of each other." After she left, Harry lay in the darkness of his temporary room, listening to the gentle sounds of the Chen household settling in for the night. The bed was soft beneath him, the duvet warm and light. Through his window he could see stars that had been hidden from view in his cupboard, could hear the distant sounds of other families going about their evening routines. For the first time in 9 years, Harry Potter fell asleep without the fear that his door might be locked from the outside, without the cramped confines of his cupboard pressing in around him, without the constant awareness that his very existence was a burden to be tolerated rather than a life to be cherished. And in his dreams, he was surrounded by yellow walls and the scent of fresh bread, by gentle voices asking how he felt and meaning it when they said they were glad he was there. Chapter 5. The Magical Alarms Trigger. Mrs. Arabella Figg had been watching No. 4 Privet Drive for 8 years, and she had never seen anything quite like the convoy of official vehicles that had descended upon the Dursley household that Friday afternoon. From her position in her front garden, ostensibly tending to her prize-winning begonias, but actually maintaining her usual surveillance of Harry Potter's supposed sanctuary, she had witnessed the arrival of the young woman with the clipboard, followed by police cars and an ambulance. She had seen Vernon Dursley emerge from the house with his face the colour of an overripe plum, gesticulating wildly at anyone who would listen. She had watched Petunia retreat into the house like a wounded animal seeking its den. Most importantly, she had seen Harry Potter leave No. 4 in the company of strangers, carrying what appeared to be his few possessions in a paper bag. Mrs. Figg dropped her gardening shears with trembling fingers and hurried into her cluttered sitting room, pushing aside cats and searching frantically for the special mirror Dumbledore had given her 8 years ago. She found it beneath a pile of Witch Weekly magazines, its silver surface gleaming with the faint, magical resonance that marked it as more than mere glass. "Albus Dumbledore," she whispered to her reflection, watching as the surface shimmered and reformed to show the familiar office of the Hogwarts headmaster. Dumbledore's lined face appeared in the mirror, his blue eyes immediately focusing with sharp attention. "Arabella? I was not expecting contact. Is everything well with young Harry?" "Professor, Harry's gone. They've taken him away." The words seemed to hang in the air between them like a physical presence. Mrs. Figg watched as the colour drained from Dumbledore's face, his usual composure cracking to reveal something raw and desperate beneath. "Gone? Arabella, you must explain precisely what you observed." Mrs. Figg recounted the afternoon's events in careful detail, from the arrival of the official-looking woman to Harry's departure with unfamiliar adults. As she spoke, she saw Dumbledore's expression grow increasingly grave. "Muggle authorities," he murmured when she had finished. "This is most troubling. Arabella, I want you to remain at your post and observe what transpires. Do not attempt to intervene directly. I must verify the status of the protective enchantments immediately." The mirror's surface returned to normal reflection, leaving Mrs. Figg staring at her own worried face. In 8 years of watching Harry Potter, she had reported dozens of concerning incidents to Dumbledore. The boy's obvious malnourishment, his fearful behaviour around his relatives, the way he seemed to shrink into himself whenever Vernon raised his voice. Each time, Dumbledore had expressed concern, but ultimately maintained that Harry was safest where he was, protected by ancient magic that required his presence at Privet Drive. Now that protection had been irreparably breached, and Mrs. Figg could only wait and wonder what forces she had set in motion. 300 miles away in his circular office atop Hogwarts' highest tower, Albus Dumbledore stood before an array of delicate silver instruments that had been monitoring Harry Potter's well-being for 8 years. The largest of these, a complex device resembling an armillary sphere crossed with a wind chime, had begun emitting a low, mournful tone that sent ice through Dumbledore's veins. The blood protection, the ancient magic that had shielded Harry since Lily Potter's sacrifice, was failing. Dumbledore's hands shook as he activated the additional monitoring charms he had placed around Privet Drive. One by one, they reported the same impossible truth. Harry Potter was no longer under the roof that had been designated as his home, was no longer under the protection of his mother's sister, was no longer safely hidden within the magical boundaries that had kept him invisible to those who would do him harm. After 8 years of careful planning, 8 years of ensuring that Harry remained safely obscure until the time came for him to enter the magical world, everything was unraveling because of Muggle bureaucracy and social services. Dumbledore moved to his fireplace with swift, economical movements, taking up a handful of flue powder and tossing it into the flames. Minerva McGonagall's office. The fire blazed green, and within moments, Professor McGonagall's stern face appeared in the flames. "Albus, what's wrong?" "Minerva, I need you to contact Kingsley Shacklebolt immediately. Tell him to meet us at Grimmauld Place within the hour. Then reach out to Alastair. He should be at the Ministry today." "What's happened?" "Harry Potter has been removed from Privet Drive by Muggle authorities. The blood protection has fallen." McGonagall's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the flue connection. "Dear Merlin, do we know who has him?" "Not yet, but we must assume the worst until proven otherwise. If Death Eaters have found a way to manipulate Muggle social services..." "I'll contact the others immediately," McGonagall said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "Albus, surely you don't think Voldemort's followers would be sophisticated enough to orchestrate something like this? 8 years ago, I would have said the same about their ability to infiltrate the Ministry. We cannot afford assumptions, Minerva." The flue connection ended, leaving Dumbledore alone with his monitoring devices and the terrible certainty that his carefully laid plans had just suffered a catastrophic failure. An hour later, the kitchen of number 12 Grimmauld Place had been hastily converted into an emergency war room. The old house, which had served as unofficial headquarters for Dumbledore's closest allies during the dark days of Voldemort's first rise, felt appropriate for another crisis involving Harry Potter's safety. Kingsley Shacklebolt sat at the battered wooden table, his official ministry robes exchanged for Muggle clothing that would allow him to investigate without attracting attention. Minerva McGonagall paced before the fireplace, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the haste with which she had travelled from Scotland. Mad-Eye Moody occupied a chair that gave him clear sight lines to all entrances, his magical eye whirring constantly as it scanned for threats that existed only in his imagination. "Let me understand this correctly," Moody growled, his scarred face even grimmer than usual. "The boy has been missing for hours, the protection is down, and we're only now organizing a response?" "Alastair, the blood protection has never failed before," Dumbledore said wearily. "I had monitoring in place, but nothing that could predict Muggle governmental intervention." "Governmental intervention, my eye," Moody snorted. "This has Death Eater written all over it. They've been planning this for years, mark my words. Probably have someone placed in the Muggle system, maybe Imperious, some social worker, into filing the right paperwork. Clever, I'll give them that." "You're suggesting that Death Eaters orchestrated Harry's removal by manipulating Muggle child protection services?" McGonagall asked, her voice skeptical. "Think about it," Moody continued, warming to his theory. "They can't get to him while he's protected, but they can't attack the protection directly either. So they find a way to make the Muggles remove him themselves. Probably been working on this since 81, placing people in key positions, building false evidence." Kingsley cleared his throat. "With respect, Alastair, that level of long-term planning would require resources and coordination that most Death Eaters simply don't possess. The ones who are still free are largely in hiding or have been integrated back into respectable society. Organized conspiracies aren't really their forte anymore." "Then explain to me how a boy who's been safely hidden for 8 years suddenly gets plucked away by Muggle authorities on a random Friday afternoon," Moody demanded. The question hung in the air, unanswered and troubling. Dumbledore stared into the empty fireplace, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies he should have considered years ago. "Kingsley," he said finally, "I need you to infiltrate the Muggle investigation. Find out which agency has Harry, where they've placed him, and what evidence led to his removal. Use whatever cover story necessary, but we need information. And if it turns out to be legitimate Muggle authorities acting on genuine concerns?" Dumbledore's silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. The question touched on issues he had been avoiding for 8 years, concerns he had rationalized as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. "Then we adapt," he said finally. "But first, we verify Harry's safety and determine the nature of the threat. Whether this is Death Eater manipulation or Muggle intervention, the result is the same. Harry Potter is vulnerable in ways he hasn't been since he was a baby." McGonagall stopped her pacing to fix Dumbledore with a stern look. "Albus, if this was legitimate intervention, if Harry was actually in danger at Privet Drive, Minerva, we cannot afford to second-guess decisions that kept Harry alive for 8 years. The blood protection was real, and it was necessary. Was it worth the cost?" she asked quietly. The question echoed in the kitchen of Grimmauld Place, like an accusation. Dumbledore met McGonagall's gaze steadily, but something in his expression suggested that he had been asking himself the same question. "We will determine that," he said, "after we ensure Harry's continued safety. Kingsley, how quickly can you establish a cover identity that would allow you access to Surrey social services?" "Give me 24 hours, Kingsley replied. "I'll need to research their procedures and create appropriate documentation. Ministry connections should allow me to insert myself into their investigation as a consulting specialist." "Do it. And Kingsley, be prepared for the possibility that Harry may not want to return to Privet Drive." The admission hung in the air like smoke. For 8 years, Dumbledore had operated on the assumption that Harry's safety trumped all other considerations, that the protection afforded by his aunt's home justified any temporary discomfort he might experience there. Now, faced with the collapse of those protections and the intervention of authorities who had found his situation worthy of emergency removal, Dumbledore was being forced to confront the possibility that he had been catastrophically wrong about what constituted safety for Harry Potter. And if he had been wrong about that, he might be wrong about a great deal else as well. Chapter 6. Mundane versus Magical Investigation. Sarah Williams had built her career on methodical documentation, but the Dursley case was proving to be one of the most thoroughly damning files she had ever assembled. Saturday morning found her in the Surrey County Council offices, officially closed for the weekend, but unofficially humming with activity, as several social workers used the quiet to catch up on paperwork. Sarah's desk had become a command center. Medical reports detailing Harry's condition, witness statements from neighbors who had observed troubling incidents over the years, and photographs of the cupboard that would serve as the centerpiece of her case. The medical evidence alone was sufficient to justify permanent removal. Dr. Hartwell's examination had revealed chronic malnutrition, evidence of repeated physical trauma, and dental neglect that suggested Harry had never received routine medical care. The X-rays showed healed fractures in his ribs and left arm, injuries that had been allowed to heal without proper medical intervention, but it was the witness statements that painted the most complete picture of systematic abuse. Mrs. Henderson from Number 6 had provided a detailed account of observing Vernon Dursley drag Harry from the garden by his hair after the boy had accidentally damaged a flower bed. Mr. Patel from Number 8 had witnessed Petunia forcing Harry to scrub the driveway with a toothbrush while Dudley played nearby. The postman had reported that mail for H. Potter was routinely thrown away, though letters continued to arrive sporadically. Each statement individually might have been dismissed as neighborhood gossip or misunderstanding. Collectively, they formed an unassailable narrative of a child who had been systematically dehumanized by the people responsible for his care. Sarah was preparing formal charges of child abuse and neglect when her telephone rang. "Miss Williams, this is Inspector Davies from Surrey Police. I understand you're handling the Potter child protection case?" "Yes, Inspector. How can I help you?" "We've had some unusual inquiries about the case. Someone claiming to be from a government oversight department wants access to our files. Says he's conducting a review of interagency cooperation procedures." Sarah frowned, making a note on her pad. "What sort of oversight department?" "That's just it. He was rather vague about the specifics. Showed proper identification, seemed to know the right terminology, but something felt off about the whole thing. Wanted to know where we'd placed the boy, who had access to the case files, that sort of thing. What was his name?" "Shacklebolt. Kingsley Shacklebolt. Says he'll be in touch with your department directly." After hanging up, Sarah stared at her notes with growing unease. In her 18 months with Surrey Social Services, she had encountered her share of oversight reviews and interagency consultations. They typically came with advance notice, proper documentation, and clear explanations of scope and purpose. This felt different. Meanwhile, 3 floors below Sarah's office, Kingsley Shacklebolt was discovering that Muggle bureaucracy was significantly more complex than the Ministry of Magic's intelligence briefings had suggested. He had spent the previous evening creating what he believed to be a convincing cover identity, credentials identifying him as a specialist consultant with the Department of Health's Child Protection Review Unit, a background in interagency cooperation protocols, and authorization to examine case files for quality assurance purposes. The documents were flawless, indistinguishable from authentic government paperwork, thanks to carefully applied magical enhancement. What his magical training had not prepared him for was the labyrinthine network of forms, procedures, and cross-references that governed access to sensitive case information in Muggle government systems. "I'm sorry, Mr. Shacklebolt," the clerk at the Surrey Police Records Department said for the 3rd time. "But I can't release case files without proper requisition forms countersigned by both the requesting department head and the local authority's data protection officer. Even with oversight authorization, there are protocols that must be followed." Kingsley resisted the urge to cast a mild confundus charm on the earnest young man. Magical intervention would leave traces that could be detected later, and Dumbledore had stressed the importance of maintaining absolute secrecy about magical involvement. "Perhaps you could direct me to the appropriate forms," Kingsley asked with forced patience. "Of course. You'll need Form 27B for interdepartmental information sharing, Form 33A for case file review authorization, and Form 15C for compliance with the Data Protection Act. Those will need to be submitted to Mrs. Patterson in compliance review, but she's on holiday until next Tuesday." Kingsley accepted the stack of forms with growing frustration. Each form referenced other forms, required information he didn't have access to, or needed approval from officials who were apparently unavailable. The system seemed designed to prevent anyone from actually accessing information without weeks of advance planning. He was beginning to understand why Muggles complained so frequently about their government. 15 miles away in the Chen family's kitchen, Harry Potter was creating problems of an entirely different nature. "Mum, the flowers are doing it again," Emma Chen called from the back garden, her voice carrying a note of bewildered concern. Patricia Chen set down her morning coffee and joined her 16-year-old daughter at the kitchen window. In the 24 hours since Harry had arrived, their small garden had undergone a transformation that defied rational explanation. The roses along the back fence, which had been struggling in the summer heat, now bloomed with impossible vibrancy. The herb garden had doubled in size overnight. Most mysteriously, the apple tree that had been barren for 3 years was now heavy with fruit. "It's like having a garden fairy," Emma said, watching as Harry sat beneath the apple tree with a book from their spare room. As they observed, a butterfly landed on his shoulder, followed by another, until he was surrounded by a cloud of orange and blue wings. "Gardens don't just transform overnight," Patricia murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. She had been gardening for 20 years and had never seen anything like the explosion of growth and color that had appeared since Harry's arrival. Inside the house, David Chen was dealing with his own inexplicable phenomena. The central heating had begun working perfectly, despite being broken for 6 months. The temperamental upstairs toilet had stopped running. Most puzzling of all, the watercolor painting he had been struggling with for weeks had somehow corrected itself overnight. Colors that had been muddy and uncertain now glowed with luminous clarity. "Patricia," David called from his study, "have you been in here this morning?" "No, why?" "My painting. It's different. Better. And I could have sworn I left it unfinished." Patricia joined her husband in the small room that served as his studio, where canvases and art supplies shared space with marking papers from his teaching position. The watercolor in question, a landscape of the Surrey countryside, sat on his easel, glowing with professional quality technique that exceeded David's usual skill level. "Maybe you did more work on it than you remember," Patricia suggested, but her voice carried the same uncertainty that had colored her comments about the garden. "Patricia, I know my own limitations. This painting is better than anything I've ever produced." They stood together in the studio, contemplating the impossible improvement to David's artwork, while outside their window, Harry continued reading beneath an apple tree that had been barren yesterday and was now heavy with ripe fruit. Neither of them had any framework for understanding that they were witnessing accidental magic, the unconscious magical responses of a young wizard experiencing genuine safety and happiness for the first time in his life. Harry's magic, suppressed for years by fear and misery, was finally beginning to express itself in ways that reflected his emotional state, making beautiful things flourish, fixing broken objects, creating small havens of peace and plenty. But the manifestations were becoming stronger and more frequent, which meant they were becoming harder to ignore or rationalize away. Back in her Surrey County Council office, Sarah Williams was scheduling the court hearings that would determine Harry's future when her telephone rang again. "Miss Williams, this is Dr. Hartwell. I've been reviewing Harry's medical file, and I wanted to discuss some additional concerns." "Of course, Doctor." "What did you find?" "Well, it's more what I didn't find. There are no vaccination records for this child, no routine checkups, no dental visits, no eye examinations. But Miss Williams, that's not the most troubling part." Sarah made notes as Dr. Hartwell continued. "I've been trying to locate Harry's birth certificate and early medical records. According to everything I can find, Harry Potter was officially declared dead on November 1st, 1981, along with his parents, James and Lily Potter. There are death certificates on file for all 3 family members." Sarah's pen stopped moving. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "Harry Potter is legally dead, Miss Williams, has been for nearly 8 years, which means the child you removed from Privet Drive doesn't officially exist." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Harry was legally dead, then he had no rights, no protections, no official status that would allow the courts to intervene on his behalf. The Dursleys couldn't be charged with abusing a child who didn't legally exist. Social services couldn't maintain custody of someone who wasn't officially alive. "Dr. Hartwell, are you certain about this?" "I've triple-checked the records. Someone would need to apply for a court order to have the death certificate reversed, but that would require proof that Harry survived whatever incident killed his parents. And Miss Williams, there's something else." "What?" "The incident report from 1981 describes the Potter family home being completely destroyed with no survivors found, but it's classified under the Official Secrets Act. I can't access the full details of what happened that night." Sarah hung up the phone and stared at her case files with growing confusion. Harry Potter was alive, sitting in the Chen family's garden reading a book. But according to every official record, he had died 8 years ago in an incident so sensitive that the details remained classified, which meant that whoever had placed him with the Dursleys had done so outside any legal framework, without proper documentation, and in complete violation of every protocol designed to protect children in state care. The Dursley case was no longer just about child abuse. It was about a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, involving classified incidents and dead children who continued to breathe and grow and suffer in cupboards under staircases, while the system pretended they didn't exist. Sarah reached for her phone to call her supervisor, then stopped. If Harry Potter was officially dead, then any investigation into his placement with the Dursleys would necessarily involve questions about how a dead child had been living in Surrey for 8 years, questions that might lead to the classified incident report from 1981, questions that people with the power to classify incidents under the Official Secrets Act might not want answered. For the first time since becoming a social worker, Sarah Williams realized she might be in over her head. But looking at the photographs of Harry's cupboard, at the medical reports detailing years of systematic neglect, at the witness statements describing a child treated as less than human, she found she didn't care about the potential consequences. Harry Potter was alive, he was in her care, and she was going to make sure he stayed safe, no matter how many official secrets she had to challenge in the process. Chapter 7. Harry Speaks His Truth. Dr. Emily Foster had been working as a child advocate for 12 years, but she had never encountered a case quite like Harry Potter. The boy sat across from her in the family interview room at Surrey County Council offices, his small frame nearly swallowed by the adult-sized chair. In the 4 days since his removal from Privet Drive, he had gained some colour in his cheeks, and his clothes had been replaced with properly fitting garments, but his green eyes still held the wary calculation of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from adults. "Harry," Dr. Foster said gently, setting aside the thick file that contained the initial reports of his case, "I want you to understand that I'm here just for you. My job is to make sure your voice is heard in all the decisions that affect your life. Does that make sense?" Harry nodded carefully. "Like Sarah?" "Similar to Sarah, yes. But my role is a bit different. Sarah works to make sure you're safe and cared for. I work to make sure the courts understand what you've experienced and what you need going forward. Doctor? Foster leaned forward slightly, her voice warm but serious. Harry, I need you to know that you can tell me anything at all, and I will believe you. No one is going to be angry with you for telling the truth. The promise seemed to catch Harry off guard. He looked at her with an expression of such desperate hope that Dr. Foster felt her heart clench. In 12 years of working with abused children, she had learned to recognize that particular look, the face of a child who had been repeatedly told that their truth didn't matter, who had learned to swallow their words to avoid making situations worse. Even if it sounds strange, Harry asked quietly. Even if it sounds very strange, indeed. Harry was quiet for a long moment, his thin fingers tracing patterns on the arm of his chair. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Uncle Vernon used to lock me in my cupboard when I did magic. Doctor, Foster made a careful note, her expression neutral despite her confusion. Magic? Can you tell me what you mean by that? Strange things would happen around me, things I couldn't control, like when Aunt Petunia cut my hair too short and it grew back overnight, or when I was trying to get away from Dudley and his friends, and I ended up on the school roof somehow. Harry's voice remained small and uncertain, as if he was still not entirely convinced he was allowed to speak these truths aloud. And your uncle would punish you for these strange things? He said I was a freak, that freaks belonged in cupboards with the other unwanted things. Harry's matter-of-fact tone was more heartbreaking than tears would have been. He said if I told anyone about the strange things, they'd take me away to a place for freaks, and no one would ever want me. Doctor, Foster continued taking notes, her clinical training helping her maintain professional composure while her heart broke for the child across from her. She had encountered children who spoke about impossible things before, usually as a result of trauma-induced fantasy or confusion about what had actually happened to them. But Harry's description was different, precise, specific, delivered without the embellishment that typically characterized fabricated stories. Harry, can you tell me about a typical day at Privet Drive? What time would you wake up? 5 in the morning, Harry said without hesitation. I had to start breakfast before Uncle Vernon got up at 6. Bacon and eggs for him and Dudley. Toast and coffee for Aunt Petunia. I wasn't supposed to eat until they were finished, and only if there was food left over. And if there wasn't food left over? Then I waited until the next meal. Aunt Petunia said it was good for me to learn self-discipline. Doctor, Foster wrote systematic food restriction/starvation in her notes. What happened after breakfast? Chores. I had to clean the kitchen, make the beds, dust the sitting room, weed the garden, wash the windows, whatever Aunt Petunia needed done. Dudley wasn't allowed to help, because Aunt Petunia said he was too important for housework. And what did you do in the afternoons? Did you have time to play? Harry looked confused by the question. Play with what? I wasn't allowed to touch Dudley's toys, and I didn't have any of my own. Mostly I tried to stay out of everyone's way. Sometimes I could read the newspapers after Uncle Vernon was finished with them, if I was careful not to wrinkle the pages. Harry, did you ever go to school? Aunt Petunia said schools were for normal children. She said freaks like me couldn't be trusted around normal children because we might hurt them with our strangeness. Each answer added another layer to the picture of systematic isolation and abuse that Dr. Foster was documenting. But it was when she asked about physical discipline that Harry's testimony became truly devastating. Uncle Vernon said that freaks needed to be reminded of their place, Harry said, his voice taking on the rehearsed quality of someone reciting lessons learned through repetition. When I did something wrong, he would use his belt. When I did magic, he would use his fists. Can you tell me about a specific time when this happened? Harry was quiet for several minutes, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but distant, as if he was describing events that had happened to someone else. Last summer, Aunt Petunia was having her bridge club over for tea. She told me to stay in my cupboard and not make any noise. But I was so thirsty, and I thought everyone was in the garden, so I snuck out to get water from the kitchen tap. Harry paused, swallowing hard before continuing. But Mrs. Mason saw me. She asked Aunt Petunia why there was a strange boy in her house. Aunt Petunia told her I was a neighbour's child she was watching as a favour. But Mrs. Mason said I looked like I needed a good meal and maybe some new clothes. Dr. Foster waited patiently, sensing that Harry was building up to something particularly difficult. That night, after everyone left, Uncle Vernon dragged me out of my cupboard. He said I'd embarrassed the family, made Aunt Petunia look bad in front of her friends. He hit me until I couldn't stand up anymore, then locked me in the cupboard without food for 3 days. Did anyone try to help you? Teachers, neighbours, anyone else who might have noticed you were hurt? I didn't go to school, remember? And the neighbours, they thought I was just Dudley's cousin visiting for the holidays. Uncle Vernon told everyone I was shy and didn't like to play outside. Harry's voice carried a note of bitter understanding. People believe what they want to believe. It's easier than asking difficult questions. Dr. Foster had to pause in her note-taking, struck by the profound sadness in that observation from a 9-year-old child. Harry had learned lessons about human nature that most adults preferred to ignore. Harry, I want to ask you about the strange things you mentioned earlier, the things your uncle called magic. Can you describe what would happen? Harry shifted uncomfortably in his chair. You'll think I'm lying. I promise you, I will not think you're lying. Sometimes when I was really upset or scared, things would happen. Glass would break, or flowers would grow where they shouldn't, or I'd end up somewhere I couldn't have gotten to on my own. Harry's voice grew smaller. Once, when Dudley and his gang were chasing me, I somehow got onto the roof of the school building. I don't remember climbing up there, but suddenly I was just there, safe from them. How did you get down? A teacher came and got me with a ladder. She asked how I'd gotten up there, but I couldn't explain it. She said it was impossible for someone my age to climb that high without help. Dr. Foster made careful notes about each incident Harry described. While she couldn't explain the phenomena he was reporting, his descriptions were consistent, detailed, and delivered without the sort of elaboration that typically characterized fantasy. More importantly, they provided additional context for the abuse he had suffered, punishment not just for normal childhood misbehavior, but for things that were apparently beyond his conscious control. Harry, I want to ask you something very important, Dr. Foster said, when he had finished describing several incidents. Do you ever want to go back to live with the Dursleys? The response was immediate and emphatic. No, please, no. I'll be good, I promise. I won't do magic anymore. I won't eat too much. I won't take up space. Please don't make me go back to the cupboard. The desperation in his voice was raw and genuine, the plea of a child who would promise anything to avoid returning to hell. Harry, listen to me carefully. You have done nothing wrong. Nothing that happened to you was your fault. The way the Dursleys treated you was wrong, and no child should ever have to live like that. Harry stared at her, as if she had spoken in a foreign language. But Uncle Vernon said, Uncle Vernon was wrong. Adults who hurt children are always wrong, no matter what excuses they give. Dr. Foster leaned forward, ensuring Harry was meeting her eyes. You deserve to be safe, to be fed, to have a proper bed and clean clothes and people who care about you. You deserve all of those things simply because you exist, not because you've earned them. Harry's composure finally cracked. He buried his face in his hands and wept with the desperate relief of someone finally being told that their suffering mattered, that their worth wasn't conditional on perfect behavior or the absence of strangeness. Dr. Foster sat quietly while Harry cried, occasionally offering gentle reassurance, but mostly just bearing witness to years of suppressed pain, finally finding release. When his tears eventually subsided, she handed him a tissue and waited for him to collect himself. "Harry, based on everything you've told me today, I'm going to recommend to the court that you never be required to return to the Dursley household. You've been incredibly brave to tell me these things, and I want you to know that your words will help make sure other children don't have to go through what you experienced." Harry wiped his eyes with the tissue, looking up at her with something approaching wonder. "Really? I don't have to go back? Really? And Harry, those strange things you told me about, whatever they are, they're not something to be ashamed of. They're part of who you are, and who you are is perfectly all right." For the first time since Dr. Foster had met him, Harry Potter smiled, a small, tentative expression, but genuine nonetheless. As she walked him back to the Chen family that afternoon, Dr. Foster reviewed the extensive notes she had taken during their session. Harry's testimony would provide crucial evidence for the prosecution of the Dursleys, and his clear preference for alternative care arrangements would carry significant weight in custody proceedings. But she found herself thinking about the strange incidents he had described with such consistent detail: glass breaking during emotional distress, impossible athletic feats, rapid hair growth, flowers blooming out of season. Taken individually, each could be explained or dismissed. Collectively, they suggested something that challenged conventional understanding of what was possible. Dr. Foster had no framework for understanding magic, but she did understand trauma, resilience, and the profound courage it took for an abused child to finally speak their truth. Whatever else Harry Potter might be, he was a brave child who had survived the unthinkable and deserved every protection the law could provide. Chapter 8. The Ministry's Impossible Choice. The emergency session of the Wizengamot had been called for a Tuesday morning in late July, but Minister Cornelius Fudge suspected that the morning's proceedings would stretch well into the afternoon, and possibly beyond. He stood at the podium in the center of the ancient chamber, surveying the semicircle of purple-robed figures who comprised magical Britain's highest judicial and legislative body. In the 8 years since Voldemort's defeat, Fudge had grown comfortable with the largely ceremonial nature of his position. The Wizengamot dealt primarily with routine legal matters, trade disputes, and the occasional dark artifacts violation. True crises, the sort that threatened the very foundations of magical society, belonged to the past, until Harry Potter had vanished into the Muggle legal system. "Lords and ladies of the Wizengamot," Fudge began, his voice carrying across the stone chamber with carefully modulated authority. "We convene today to address a matter of unprecedented complexity involving the safety and security of Harry Potter." A murmur rippled through the assembled members. The name still carried weight, 8 years after the defeat of He Who Must Not Be Named. The boy who lived remained a symbol of magical Britain's triumph over darkness, a living reminder that even the most terrible evil could be overcome. "As many of you are aware," Fudge continued, "young Mr. Potter has been removed from his designated guardians by Muggle authorities and placed in alternative care arrangements. This development has rendered our traditional protective measures ineffective and created a situation that threatens to expose our world to unprecedented Muggle scrutiny." Lord Lucius Malfoy rose from his seat in the front row, his platinum hair catching the magical light that illuminated the chamber. "Minister, if I may, what exactly have our Obliviator teams reported regarding the feasibility of standard memory modification protocols?" Fudge glanced toward the gallery where senior ministry officials sat in advisory capacity. "Mr. Clearwater, would you please address the Wizengamot regarding your department's assessment?" Broderick Clearwater, head of the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, stood with obvious reluctance. "My lords and ladies, the Obliviator teams report that the Muggle legal system presents unique challenges. The Potter case has been documented across multiple government agencies, with copies of files maintained at various levels of their bureaucracy. Standard memory modification would require simultaneous intervention with dozens of Muggle officials, many of whom have only peripheral involvement in the case. "Surely our obliviators are capable of coordinating such an operation?" demanded Lady Augusta Longbottom from her seat near the back of the chamber. "The scope of required modifications presents significant risks," Clearwater admitted. "Comprehensive memory alteration across multiple Muggle institutions could result in inconsistencies that might actually draw more attention to magical involvement. More concerning, the case has generated physical evidence, medical examinations, witness statements, photographic documentation that exists independently of individual memory." A heavy silence settled over the chamber. For generations, the magical world had relied on obliviation as the ultimate solution to exposure risks. The idea that Muggle documentation could be too extensive and complex for magical intervention challenged fundamental assumptions about magical superiority over Muggle systems. "Minister," Lucius Malfoy said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence that had made him one of the Wizengamot's most influential members, "perhaps we should consider whether immediate intervention is truly necessary." Fudge frowned. "Lord Malfoy, I'm not certain I understand your meaning." "Consider the advantages of allowing the current situation to develop naturally. Young Potter has been removed from the protective environment that has sheltered him for 8 years. He is now exposed to the full complexity of Muggle society, dependent upon their institutions and their limited understanding of the world. When the time comes for him to enter our world, assuming that time ever comes, he will do so from a position of weakness rather than strength." The implications of Malfoy's suggestion rippled through the chamber like cold water. Several members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward with obvious interest. "You're suggesting," said Lord Ogden slowly, "that we allow Harry Potter to remain in Muggle custody indefinitely?" "I'm suggesting that we consider all options," Malfoy replied smoothly. "The boy has lived as a Muggle for 8 years. Perhaps it would be educational for him to experience the full limitations of that existence. Should any future dark threats arise, a weakened Potter might be more manageable than one who has been coddled and protected from the realities of the world." The chamber erupted in voices as members began speaking simultaneously. Some expressed outrage at the suggestion of abandoning the boy who lived to Muggle care. Others, particularly among the old pureblood families, seemed intrigued by the idea of limiting Potter's future influence through strategic neglect. "Order!" Fudge called, striking his gavel against the podium. "Lord Malfoy, while your perspective is noted, we must consider our legal and moral obligations to young Mr. Potter." From his seat in the front row, Albus Dumbledore rose slowly. At 78, the former Chief Warlock commanded respect through decades of service to magical Britain, and the chamber fell silent as he prepared to speak. "Minister, lords and ladies," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "we must not lose sight of the fundamental issue at stake. Harry Potter's protection has been maintained for 8 years through ancient magic that requires specific conditions to function. Blood protection, based on his mother's sacrifice, can only be sustained while he calls his mother's sister's house his home." "And yet," interrupted Lord Knott from the middle section, "that protection has already failed. The boy has been removed from his aunt's house, the blood wards have fallen, and we are left with no magical safeguards whatsoever." "The protection can be restored," Dumbledore said firmly, "but only if Harry returns to Privet Drive of his own will. Coerced return would invalidate the magical foundation upon which the protection rests." "You're saying," Lady Bones observed with sharp attention, "that we need the boy to choose to return to a home from which Muggle authorities have removed him due to abuse allegations?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Dumbledore's blue eyes, usually twinkling with gentle humor, were grave as he considered his response. "I am saying that magical protection carries magical requirements. The choice between safety through blood protection and safety through Muggle institutions may not be ours to make." "But surely," Lord Abbot interjected. We can influence the boy's decision through appropriate guidance? Any magical influence over Harry's choice would corrupt the very protection we seek to restore, Dumbledore replied. The magic recognizes coercion in all its forms. From the back corner of the chamber, a voice spoke that rarely addressed the full Wizengamot. Perhaps the question we should be asking is whether the boy deserves protection from his relatives, rather than protection through them. All heads turned toward Professor Severus Snape, who sat in the advisors section by virtue of his position as head of Slytherin House. His black hair hung like curtains around his sallow face, but his dark eyes were focused with unusual intensity. Professor Snape, Fudge said with barely concealed surprise, you wish to address the Wizengamot? I wish to address the willful blindness that has characterized our approach to Harry Potter's welfare for 8 years, Snape replied, rising to his feet with characteristic grace. The Muggle authorities removed the boy because they found evidence of systematic abuse. Are we to ignore that evidence simply because it complicates our preferred arrangements? Lucius Malfoy's pale eyes glittered with interest. Severus, surely you're not suggesting we should accept Muggle judgment over magical wisdom? I'm suggesting that a child who has been starved, beaten, and confined deserves better protection than we have provided. Snape's voice carried an edge of barely controlled emotion that made several Wizengamot members lean forward in their seats. If our magical protection requires the continued abuse of Lily Potter's son, then perhaps our protection is worth less than we have believed. The invocation of Lily Potter's name sent a shock through the chamber. Few had ever heard Snape speak of the war's casualties with anything approaching personal investment. Professor Snape, Dumbledore said quietly, you understand as well as anyone the importance of keeping Harry safe from those who would harm him. I understand, Snape replied, his gaze meeting Dumbledore's directly. The importance of ensuring that we are not among those who harm him. The rebuke was subtle, but unmistakable. Several Wizengamot members exchanged glances as they realized they were witnessing a public challenge to Dumbledore's judgment by one of his most trusted allies. The blood protection, Snape continued, addressing the chamber at large, was created through a mother's love and sacrifice. Are we honoring that sacrifice by ensuring her son's continued suffering, or are we perverting it by using love as justification for neglect? Minister Fudge found himself in the unprecedented position of mediating a philosophical and moral debate among some of magical Britain's most influential figures. The practical question of what to do about Harry Potter's situation was becoming entangled with larger questions about the magical world's responsibilities and ethical foundations. Lords and ladies, Fudge said finally, we clearly have multiple perspectives on how to proceed. Lord Malfoy suggests allowing the current situation to continue. Chief Warlock Dumbledore argues for restoration of blood protection. Professor Snape advocates for accepting Muggle custody as legitimate protection. Are there other views to be heard? Lord Ogden stood once more, his aged voice carrying the weight of his family's centuries of service to magical lore. Minister, might I suggest that our decision should be guided by a simple principle? What course of action best serves Harry Potter's welfare, independent of political or strategic considerations? The question was deceptively simple, but it cut to the heart of the crisis facing the Wizengamot. For 8 years, decisions about Harry Potter's life had been made based on magical convenience, strategic advantage, and institutional preference. The Muggle authorities were forcing them to confront the possibility that those considerations might not align with the welfare of the child at the center of their debates. Lords and ladies, Fudge announced, we will recess for 1 hour to allow members time to consider the various perspectives presented. When we reconvene, we will vote on a formal course of action regarding the Potter situation. As the Wizengamot members filed out for their recess, Conversations continued in hushed, urgent tones. The magical world was facing a choice that would define not only Harry Potter's future, but their own understanding of responsibility, protection, and the limits of magical authority in a world increasingly governed by Muggle institutions and Muggle law. And for the first time in 8 years, there was no clear consensus about what the right choice might be. Chapter 9. Sarah Williams versus Wizarding Authority. Sarah Williams knew something was wrong the moment the elderly man walked into her office. It wasn't his appearance that triggered her instincts. The long silver beard and half-moon spectacles gave him the harmless air of a university professor emeritus. It wasn't his credentials, which identified him as Dr. Albus Dumbledore, a consulting specialist in family crisis intervention from the Department of Education's Special Circumstances Review Board. The paperwork was impeccable, the authorization codes checked out, and his supposed supervisor had confirmed his assignment when Sarah called to verify. It was the way her mind kept trying to slip away from important questions whenever she looked directly into his twinkling blue eyes. "Miss Williams," Dumbledore said as he settled into the chair across from her desk, "I understand you've been handling the Potter case with admirable dedication. However, there are certain complexities to this situation that may not be immediately apparent." "What sort of complexities?" Sarah asked, pulling Harry's file closer and flipping it open to the medical reports. "Because from my perspective, we have a clear case of systematic child abuse that requires permanent removal from the perpetrators." "Indeed, the situation appears quite straightforward from a conventional standpoint," Dumbledore agreed, his voice carrying a gentle persuasiveness that seemed to wrap around Sarah's thoughts like warm honey. "However, sometimes what appears to be neglect may actually be necessary protection. Sometimes keeping a child safe requires arrangements that seem harsh to outside observers." Sarah felt an odd tugging sensation in her mind, as if someone was trying to convince her that black was actually white through sheer force of reasonable-sounding words. She blinked hard and focused on the photographs of Harry's cupboard bedroom spread across her desk. "Dr. Dumbledore, are you suggesting that locking a 9-year-old child in a spider-infested cupboard constitutes protection? I'm suggesting that there are forces in this world, dangerous individuals with connections to the boy's tragic history, who pose threats that conventional child protection services are not equipped to handle." Dumbledore leaned forward slightly, and Sarah felt that strange tugging sensation grow stronger. Perhaps it would be best for all concerned if Harry were returned to his relatives, where certain safeguards can continue to function. The words seemed reasonable, even compelling, but Sarah found herself gripping her pen with white-knuckled intensity as she fought against the inexplicable urge to agree. Her professional training kicked in, the same instincts that had helped her recognize manipulation tactics from abusive parents trying to regain custody of their children. "What safeguards?" she asked sharply. "What specific protections are in place at Privet Drive that justify subjecting a child to malnutrition, physical abuse, and educational deprivation?" Dumbledore's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise. "Miss Williams, surely you can see that some situations require unconventional approaches. The boy's welfare is best served by arrangements that may not conform to standard protocols." "Show me the documentation," Sarah said, reaching for her notepad. "Where are the risk assessments, the safety plans, the oversight reports? If Harry Potter is in protective custody, where is the court order authorizing his placement? Where are the regular welfare checks that should have been conducted over the past 8 years? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Dumbledore's fingers steepled before him as he seemed to consider his response, and Sarah noticed a thin woman with greying hair standing quietly in the corner of her office. She couldn't remember the woman entering, couldn't recall being introduced, but somehow her presence seemed natural and unremarkable. "Miss Williams," Dumbledore said finally, "there are circumstances, government classifications, national security considerations, that prevent the disclosure of certain protective arrangements. I'm sure you understand the need for discretion in sensitive cases." "What I understand," Sarah replied, her voice growing colder, "is that someone has been lying to me since this case began. Harry Potter was legally declared dead 8 years ago. He has no official identity, no educational records, no medical history. Someone has kept him hidden from every system designed to protect children, and now you want me to return him to the people who abused him based on vague claims about classified protections." The elderly man's composure finally cracked slightly. "Miss Williams, you must understand. No, Dr. Dumbledore, you must understand." Sarah stood, her small frame radiating the sort of controlled fury that made even experienced police officers take notice. "I have medical evidence of systematic abuse. I have witness statements documenting years of neglect. I have a child's own testimony about being beaten, starved, and confined. And you want me to ignore all of that based on your word that mysterious safeguards make it necessary?" The woman in the corner stepped forward, and Sarah was struck by the sharp intelligence in her green eyes. "Miss Williams, perhaps we could discuss this more privately." "I'm sorry. Who are you exactly?" Sarah asked, finally questioning the woman's presence in her office. "Professor McGonagall," the woman said, and something in her voice suggested she was struggling with internal conflict. "I'm Dr. Dumbledore's colleague." "Professor McGonagall," Sarah repeated, making a note on her pad. "And you're here to convince me that child abuse is acceptable if it serves some greater purpose?" McGonagall's lips thinned into a sharp line. "Miss Williams, I'm here because I've been asking myself the same questions you're asking." Dumbledore turned toward McGonagall with an expression of sharp alarm. "Minerva!" "No, Albus," McGonagall interrupted, her voice carrying decades of suppressed doubt. "I stood on Privet Drive in November 1981. I watched those people for an entire day. I saw Vernon Dursley kick a cat. I saw Petunia Dursley scream at a neighbour child for getting too close to her precious garden. I told you they were the worst sort of muggles imaginable." Sarah looked between the two professors, sensing undercurrents of conflict that went far beyond the current case. "You were there when Harry was placed with the Dursleys?" "I was there," McGonagall said, her voice heavy with 8 years of regret. "I argued against the placement. I said they would never love him, never treat him as anything more than an unwanted burden. And Albus told me that love would grow, that blood ties would ensure protection." "Minerva, please," Dumbledore said quietly. "There were considerations." "What considerations could possibly justify ignoring clear evidence that those people were unfit guardians?" McGonagall demanded, her composure finally cracking entirely. "What was so important that it was worth condemning Lily Potter's son to 8 years of misery?" Sarah found herself in the unprecedented position of watching what appeared to be a decades-long professional relationship implode in her office. She cleared her throat, drawing both professors' attention back to her. "Dr. Dumbledore, Professor McGonagall, I appreciate that you have historical perspective on this case. But my responsibility is clear. Harry Potter has been systematically abused. He is now in safe temporary care, and I will not authorize his return to an unsafe environment based on vague assurances about classified protections." "Miss Williams," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying renewed urgency, "you don't understand the larger forces at work." "Then explain them," Sarah interrupted. "Provide documentation. Give me something concrete to work with instead of asking me to take everything on faith." The request hung between them like a challenge. Sarah could see Dumbledore wrestling with something, some internal calculation about revelation versus concealment, while McGonagall watched him with an expression of growing disappointment. "I cannot," Dumbledore admitted, finally. "The nature of the protection requires secrecy." "Then Harry stays where he is," Sarah said with finality. Professor McGonagall, would you like to see the evidence we've collected? Perhaps you'd like to understand exactly what your blood protection has cost Lily Potter's son? Sarah opened Harry's file and began laying out photographs, the cupboard bedroom, the deadbolts mounted on the outside, the medical reports showing healed fractures and chronic malnutrition. McGonagall's face grew steadily paler as she reviewed the documentation. 8 years, McGonagall whispered, staring at the photographs. He's lived like this for 8 years, and we told ourselves it was for his own good. Professor McGonagall, Sarah said more gently, if you have information that could help us understand how Harry ended up in this situation, I need you to tell me. Not hints about classified protections or mysterious safeguards. Facts. Documentation. Truth. McGonagall looked at Dumbledore, then back at the photographs spread across Sarah's desk. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 8 years of suppressed guilt. Miss Williams, Harry Potter was placed with his relatives without any formal assessment of their suitability as guardians. No home study was conducted, no background checks were performed, no ongoing oversight was arranged. He was delivered to their doorstep with a letter explaining that his parents were dead and he was now their responsibility. Minerva, Dumbledore warned. No, Albus, she deserves to know. McGonagall's green eyes blazed with righteous anger. Miss Williams, Harry Potter was placed based on one man's belief that blood relation was sufficient to guarantee love and protection. When I voiced concerns, I was told that my doubts demonstrated insufficient faith in the power of family bonds. Sarah made careful notes as McGonagall spoke. So there was no legal proceeding, no court involvement, no social services assessment. There was no Muggle involvement whatsoever, McGonagall confirmed. The placement was made unilaterally, based on alternative authority structures. What sort of alternative authority structures? McGonagall glanced at Dumbledore again, who seemed to have aged a decade in the past hour. Miss Williams, there are aspects of this case that involve institutional considerations, beyond standard child protection protocols. Professor McGonagall, Sarah said quietly, are you telling me that Harry Potter was placed in an abusive home by people who had no legal authority to make custody decisions? The question hung in the air like smoke. McGonagall's struggle was visible as she wrestled between loyalty to her colleague and responsibility to the truth. Yes, she said finally. I believe that's exactly what I'm telling you. Sarah set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, staring at the two professors who had just confirmed her worst suspicions about the case. Dr. Dumbledore, I'm going to give you one last chance to provide concrete documentation of legitimate authority for Harry's placement. Legal guardianship papers, court orders, government authorizations, anything that demonstrates you had the right to place him with the Dursleys. Miss Williams, because if you cannot provide that documentation, then what we're discussing is kidnapping. Someone took a child from the scene of his parents' deaths and delivered him to people who proceeded to abuse him for 8 years. And if this matter involves government cover-ups or institutional conspiracies, then I think the media would be very interested in the story. The threat was delivered quietly, but its implications were unmistakable. Dumbledore's blue eyes lost their twinkling warmth as he realized that Sarah Williams was not going to be intimidated, manipulated, or reasoned away from her position. Miss Williams, he said carefully, I believe you may be underestimating the complications that could arise from pursuing this matter through conventional channels. And I believe you're underestimating my commitment to protecting Harry Potter from anyone who would harm him, Sarah replied, including well-meaning professors who think abuse is acceptable as long as it serves their purposes. As Dumbledore and McGonagall finally left her office, Sarah Williams realized she had just declared war on forces she didn't fully understand. But looking at the photographs of Harry's cupboard, at the medical reports documenting years of systematic neglect, she found she didn't care what sort of institutions or individuals she was challenging. Harry Potter deserved protection, truth, and justice, and Sarah Williams was going to make sure he got all three, no matter who tried to stop her. Chapter 10. The Chen family's stand. Patricia Chen had filled out hundreds of forms in her 22 years as a primary school teacher, but the guardianship petition for Harry Potter felt different from any paperwork she had ever completed. She sat at her kitchen table on a Thursday morning in early August, carefully transcribing information from the temporary custody documents that Sarah Williams had provided. Each question on the permanent guardianship application seemed designed to capture not just legal facts, but the emotional reality of what had developed over the past 2 weeks since Harry's arrival. Relationship to minor child, Patricia wrote, prospective permanent guardian in the blank space, though the clinical language felt inadequate to describe what Harry had become to their family. He wasn't just a placement or a temporary arrangement. He was the boy who helped her tend the garden each morning, who listened with fascination to David's art history lectures over dinner, who had taught their 16-year-old daughter Emma to appreciate the simple pleasure of reading under the apple tree. Reason for seeking guardianship. Patricia paused, her pen hovering over the form. The legal answer was straightforward. Harry needed permanent placement after removal from an abusive home. But the deeper truth was more complex. In 2 weeks, Harry Potter had transformed their household from a comfortable family of 3 into something richer, more complete. He belonged with them in ways that transcended legal arrangements. She wrote, "Minor child requires permanent safe placement following removal from abusive guardians. Applicants have developed strong attachment to child and are committed to providing long-term, stable home environment." "Mum," Emma called from the back garden, "you need to see this." Patricia set down her pen and joined her daughter outside, where Harry sat cross-legged beneath the apple tree with a book spread across his lap. The tree, which had been barren for 3 years, was now so heavy with fruit that several branches required wooden supports to prevent them from breaking under the weight. But it was the area immediately around Harry that made Patricia catch her breath. A perfect circle of wildflowers had appeared overnight. Daisies, cornflowers, and poppies that had no business blooming in August, arranged in concentric rings around the base of the tree. Butterflies moved through the flowers in lazy spirals, seemingly drawn to the space where Harry sat reading. Even the grass beneath the tree was different, deeper green, softer, as if it were growing in particularly fertile soil. "It started about an hour ago," Emma said quietly. "I was watching from the kitchen window. The flowers just appeared. One moment there was ordinary grass, and the next moment there were flowers blooming like it was spring." Patricia approached the remarkable garden display, kneeling down to touch one of the daisies. The flower was real, fully rooted, with petals that felt substantial beneath her fingers. This wasn't some elaborate prank or coincidence. It was impossible, inexplicable, and beautiful. "Harry?" she called gently. He looked up from his book, his green eyes bright with contentment. "Yes, Mrs. Chen." "Did you notice anything unusual this morning? About the garden?" Harry glanced around at the flowers as if seeing them for the first time. "Oh," he said with mild surprise. "They're very pretty, aren't they? I was thinking about how nice it would be if the tree had flowers as well as apples." And then he trailed off, looking uncertain. "And then they appeared?" "Things like that happen sometimes," Harry said matter-of-factly. "Uncle Vernon used to get very angry about it. He said it proved I was a freak who didn't belong with normal people." Patricia felt a familiar surge of protective anger at any mention of Vernon Dursley. In the 2 weeks since Harry's arrival, she had heard enough fragments of his life at Privet Drive to understand that the word freak had been used as a weapon against him for years. "Harry," she said firmly, kneeling beside him, "there is nothing freakish about you. You're a remarkable, wonderful boy, and if unusual things happen around you, then we'll simply have to get used to unusual things." "Even if the neighbors think we're strange?" Patricia glanced toward the houses on either side of their property. where she had noticed an increasing number of curious glances directed toward their garden over the past week. The Johnsons next door had commented on the extraordinary growth of their shared hedge. The Patels across the street had mentioned that their rose bushes were blooming with unprecedented vigor. Mrs. Whitfield down the lane had stopped Patricia at the grocery store to ask what sort of fertilizer was producing such remarkable results. "Harry," Patricia said, making a decision that would reshape their family's understanding of normal, "if the neighbors think we're strange because we have a beautiful garden and a happy family, then I think we can live with being strange." Harry's smile in response to those words was radiant enough to make the flowers around him seem ordinary by comparison. That afternoon, David Chen returned from his summer teaching workshops to find his wife researching family law statutes at their kitchen table while Emma helped Harry arrange apples from their impossible tree into baskets for their neighbors. "How did the guardianship consultation go?" he asked, settling beside Patricia and reviewing the forms spread across the table. "Mr. Harrison says our application is straightforward legally, but he wanted to warn us about potential complications." Patricia set down her pen, her expression troubled. "David, there are people who are going to fight us for custody of Harry. The Dursleys? Possibly, but also others. Mr. Harrison said there have been inquiries from various government departments about Harry's case. Apparently, some very important people are taking an interest in his placement." David studied his wife's face, recognizing the determined expression that had characterized her approach to every challenge they had faced in their 25-year marriage. "And what did you tell Mr. Harrison?" "I told him that we don't care how important those people think they are. Harry belongs with us now." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell ringing with aggressive persistence. Through the front window, David could see a massive man in a business suit standing on their doorstep, his face purple with rage, and his fist raised to pound on their door. "That's Vernon Dursley," Patricia said grimly, recognizing him from the police photographs in Harry's case file. David started toward the front door, but Patricia caught his arm. "Wait, I'll handle this." She opened the door with the chain still engaged, studying Vernon Dursley through the narrow gap. He was even more intimidating in person than in photographs, tall, broad, and radiating the sort of aggressive entitlement that made her skin crawl. "You're the people who have my nephew," Vernon said without preamble. "I'm here to take him home where he belongs." "Your nephew belongs here now," Patricia replied calmly. "And if you don't leave our property immediately, I'm calling the police." Vernon's small eyes narrowed. "Listen here, woman. That boy has been my responsibility for 8 years. You can't just steal him away because some interfering social worker filled your head with lies about his upbringing." "Lies?" Patricia's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "Mr. Dursley, I've seen the medical reports. I've seen photographs of the cupboard where you kept him. Those aren't lies. They're evidence of systematic abuse. That boy needed discipline. He's always been unnatural, causing trouble with his freakishness. We gave him structure, boundaries, proper consequences for his behavior." The word freakishness hit Patricia like a physical blow. Behind her, she could hear Harry's sharp intake of breath from the kitchen, could sense his fear even through the walls that separated them. "Mr. Dursley," Patricia said, her voice dropping to the sort of quiet intensity that made her most difficult students sit up and pay attention. "If you ever refer to Harry as a freak again, I will personally ensure that every newspaper in Surrey knows exactly how you treated a 9-year-old child for 8 years. Vernon's face grew even more purple. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. That boy is dangerous. The strange things that happen around him, you have no idea what you're inviting into your home." "I know exactly what I'm inviting into my home," Patricia replied. "A child who has never been loved, who has never been safe, who has never been told that he matters. And Mr. Dursley, I can promise you that Harry Potter will never go back to your house. Not today, not ever. You can't keep him. I have rights. You have no rights to a child you abused for 8 years. And if you come to this house again, if you so much as drive down this street, I will call the police and press charges for harassment and intimidation." Patricia closed the door firmly, engaging all 3 locks before leaning against the wood and taking a shaking breath. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see Harry standing frozen near the table, his face pale with terror. "Harry," she called gently. "He's gone. You're safe." But even as she spoke the words, Patricia noticed something extraordinary happening around their house. The windows, which had been sparkling clean that morning, now seemed to gleam with an inner light. The front door felt somehow stronger beneath her hands, as if it had been reinforced by invisible forces. In the garden, the impossible flowers were glowing softly in the afternoon sunlight. That evening, as the Chen family sat down to dinner, Patricia found herself looking around their transformed home with wonder. The kitchen seemed warmer, more welcoming than ever before. The dining room felt like a sanctuary where no harm could ever reach them. Even the air itself seemed different, cleaner, lighter, filled with a sense of protection that she couldn't quite explain. "David," she said as they cleared the dinner dishes. "Do you feel it too? The way the house feels different." David paused, a plate halfway to the sink. "I thought it was just my imagination. But yes, it feels safer somehow. More solid." "It's because Harry belongs here," Emma said, matter-of-factly, looking up from her homework at the kitchen table. "The house knows it, and it's protecting him." The casual way their teenage daughter accepted the impossible made Patricia realize that their family had crossed some invisible threshold. They were no longer people who lived in a world where flowers bloomed only in their proper seasons, where houses felt exactly as substantial as their bricks and mortar indicated, where love was just an emotion rather than a force that could reshape reality. They were people who loved Harry Potter, and that love had apparently made them part of something larger and stranger than they had ever imagined. "Mrs. Chen," Harry said quietly from his seat at the table, "are you sure you want to keep me? Even with all the strange things?" Patricia looked at this remarkable boy who had brought impossible flowers, protective magic, and profound joy into their lives. "Harry," she said firmly, "there is nothing that could make us not want you. You're our family now, and family means we protect each other no matter what." Outside their kitchen window, the neighbors on Willow Lane were beginning to notice that the streetlights burned more brightly than usual, that their own gardens were showing unprecedented vigor, and that the entire street felt somehow more peaceful than it had in years. The Chen family's love for Harry Potter was creating ripples of protection and beauty that extended far beyond their own household, weaving a new kind of magic into the fabric of their ordinary suburban street. And in the magical world's monitoring stations, alarms were beginning to sound as entirely new forms of protective enchantment appeared around a boy who was supposed to be safely hidden, but miserable, not joyfully creating havens of peace in the heart of Muggle Surrey. Chapter 11. Wizengamot Emergency Session. The ancient chamber of the Wizengamot had not seen such tension since the trials that followed Voldemort's defeat 8 years earlier. Amelia Bones surveyed the packed gallery from her position as head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, noting the unusual collection of witches and wizards who had requested permission to observe the formal inquiry into the matter of Harry James Potter, custody and guardianship review. Representatives from every major magical family had secured seats, along with ministry officials, Hogwarts faculty, and members of the public whose interest in the boy who lived had never truly faded. "This emergency session of the Wizengamot will come to order," announced Chief Warlock Bartemius Crouch, his austere voice echoing off the stone walls. "We convene today to conduct formal inquiry into the placement, custody, and guardianship arrangements for Harry James Potter following recent developments in Muggle legal proceedings." From his designated seat in the center of the chamber, Albus Dumbledore appeared calm and composed, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought him before the Wizengamot as a respondent rather than an advisor. His blue eyes held their customary twinkle, but those who knew him well could detect the strain beneath his serene facade. "Madam Bones," Crouch continued, "as the presenting authority in this matter, you may begin your opening statement." Amelia Bones rose from her seat, her monocle glinting in the magical light as she reviewed her extensive notes. "Lords and ladies of the Wizengamot, we are here today because the magical world's most famous child has been removed from his designated guardians by Muggle authorities who found evidence of systematic abuse. This development has raised fundamental questions about our responsibilities, our oversight, and our decision-making regarding the welfare of magical children." A murmur rippled through the gallery, while the basic facts of Harry's situation had become known throughout magical Britain over the past week. Hearing them stated formally in the Wizengamot chamber gave them new weight and urgency. "The evidence we will present today," Bones continued, "will demonstrate that Harry Potter was placed with his Muggle relatives without appropriate assessment, monitoring, or legal authority. Furthermore, we will show that concerns about his welfare were dismissed or ignored for 8 years while he suffered conditions that no child, magical or Muggle, should ever endure." "Madam Bones," interrupted Lord Malfoy from the front row, "surely you're not suggesting that the Wizengamot should second-guess decisions made during the crisis period following he who must not be named's defeat?" "Lord Malfoy, I'm suggesting that crisis conditions do not exempt us from responsibility for the consequences of our decisions. If anything, they increase that responsibility." Bones gestured toward the evidence table, where photographers had arranged enlargements of the photographs taken from Harry's case file. The images of the cupboard bedroom, the deadbolts mounted on the outside, and the medical reports documenting malnutrition and healed fractures created a stark visual testament to 8 years of systematic neglect. "Lords and ladies, these photographs were taken by Muggle authorities during their investigation. They show the living conditions that we, through our placement decisions and lack of oversight, condemned Harry Potter to endure from age 1 to age 9. The gallery fell silent as members absorbed the visual evidence. Several witches in the public section covered their mouths in horror. Even Lord Malfoy's usual composure seemed shaken as he studied the documentation of the Dursleys' treatment of Harry. "The question before us today," Bones stated, "is not whether mistakes were made. The evidence of that is undeniable. The question is what accountability measures this body will implement to ensure such failures never occur again." When Bones returned to her seat, Chief Warlock Crouch called the first witness. "The Wizengamot will hear testimony from Professor McGonagall regarding her observations of the Dursley household in November 1981. McGonagall rose with evident reluctance, her usually straight posture betraying the weight of 8 years of suppressed guilt. As she took the witness stand, her green eyes met Dumbledore's briefly before focusing on the Wizengamot members. "Professor McGonagall," Bones began, "please describe your observations of the Dursley family on November 1st, 1981. "I spent an entire day watching number 4 Privet Drive," McGonagall said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional cost of her testimony. "I observed Vernon Dursley kick a cat for the apparent crime of being in his garden. I watched Petunia Dursley scream at a neighbor child for allowing a ball to roll near her precious flower beds. They demonstrated no kindness, no warmth, no indication that they possessed the capacity to love a child. And did you voice these concerns to anyone?" I attempted to discuss my observations with Chief Warlock Dumbledore. I told him that the Dursleys were the worst sort of Muggles imaginable, that they would never love Harry, that they would treat him as an unwanted burden. The admission sent a shock through the chamber. Several Wizengamot members leaned forward in their seats, while the gallery buzzed with hushed conversations. "And how did Chief Warlock Dumbledore respond to your concerns?" McGonagall's voice grew quieter, weighted with 8 years of regret. "He told me that love would grow, that blood ties would ensure protection, that my doubts demonstrated insufficient faith in the power of family bonds. Professor McGonagall, in your expert opinion as someone who has worked with children for decades, were the Dursleys suitable guardians for Harry Potter? No, McGonagall said firmly. They were not then, and the evidence suggests they never became suitable guardians. I should have pressed my concerns more forcefully. I should have demanded a formal assessment. I failed Harry Potter, and I have carried that failure for 8 years. As McGonagall returned to her seat, an unexpected voice called out from the gallery. "If I may address the Wizengamot," came the cultured tones of Narcissa Malfoy. Chief Warlock Crouch frowned. "Mrs. Malfoy, this is a formal proceeding. The gallery is not permitted to—" "With respect, Chief Warlock, I believe Mrs. Malfoy has requested formal recognition as an interested party," interrupted Lord Malfoy. "As a member of an ancient magical family with concerns about child welfare policies, she has standing to address this body." Crouch consulted his procedural manual with obvious reluctance. "Very well. Mrs. Malfoy, you may speak." Narcissa Malfoy rose from her seat in the gallery with aristocratic grace, her pale hair perfectly arranged, and her robes impeccably tailored. Her appearance in the witness area created a stir. It was highly unusual for wives of Wizengamot members to participate directly in proceedings. "Lords and ladies," Narcissa began, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to magical nobility, "I appear before you not as the wife of Lord Malfoy, but as a mother who is horrified by what we have allowed to happen to Harry Potter." "Mrs. Malfoy," Chief Warlock Crouch said carefully, "what is your interest in this matter?" "My interest is simple. If we can condemn the boy who lived to 8 years of abuse through our negligence, what protections exist for any magical child? What prevents other children from disappearing into situations where they are starved, beaten, and treated as less than human?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Narcissa's reputation for fierce protection of her own son gave her words particular weight. She was known throughout magical society as a woman who would challenge any authority that threatened a child's welfare. "Furthermore," Narcissa continued, "I find myself in the unusual position of agreeing completely with Mrs. Weasley, who I believe wishes to address this body as well." All heads turned toward the gallery where Molly Weasley sat with her husband Arthur. The idea of Narcissa Malfoy and Molly Weasley finding common cause was so unprecedented that several Wizengamot members exchanged glances of disbelief. "Mrs. Weasley," Crouch said with evident confusion, "do you wish to address the Wizengamot?" Molly Weasley rose, her red hair slightly disheveled, and her robes showing the practical wear of someone who spent her days caring for 7 children. She looked distinctly out of place in the formal chamber, but her voice carried the moral authority of someone who had devoted her life to protecting young people. "Chief Warlock, I have raised 7 children and helped care for countless others through the war years. I know what love looks like, and I know what neglect looks like." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Harry Potter was placed with people who treated him worse than they would treat a house elf. We failed him, and we must do better." "Mrs. Weasley," Lord Malfoy interjected, "surely you're not suggesting that the Wizengamot should have interfered with Muggle family arrangements?" "I'm suggesting that we should have ensured Harry Potter was placed with people who would love him, magical or Muggle." Molly's voice carried the heat of maternal outrage. "Narcissa is right. If we can fail Harry Potter so completely, we can fail any child. Our children deserve better protection than we provided." The sight of Narcissa Malfoy nodding in agreement with Molly Weasley created an atmosphere of surreal tension in the chamber. Their alliance on this issue transcended decades of political and social antagonism, united by shared concern for child welfare. "Lords and ladies," Narcissa said, addressing the Wizengamot directly, "I move that we conduct a formal vote of no confidence in Chief Warlock Dumbledore's guardianship decisions regarding Harry Potter." The motion sent shock waves through the chamber. A vote of no confidence would be a severe censure of Dumbledore's judgment and could potentially strip him of his authority over Harry's placement. "Seconded," Molly Weasley called out immediately. Chief Warlock Crouch looked toward Dumbledore, who rose slowly from his seat. "Lords and ladies, I understand the emotions that drive this motion. However, I ask you to consider the broader context of the decisions made in November 1981. We were emerging from the darkest period in recent magical history. The priority was ensuring Harry's immediate survival. Chief Warlock Dumbledore," Amelia Bones interjected, "survival is not the same as welfare. A child can survive abuse while suffering irreparable harm to his development, his trust, his understanding of his own worth. Furthermore," added Lord Ogden from the middle section, "the evidence suggests that our monitoring of Harry's situation was inadequate to ensure even basic survival. Medical reports indicate chronic malnutrition and untreated injuries." Dumbledore's composure finally showed signs of strain. "Lords and ladies, the placement was made with the best intentions based on available information. The blood protection," interrupted Lady Longbottom, "required 8 years of systematic abuse to maintain. If that is the price of magical protection, perhaps we need to reconsider what we mean by protection." The debate continued for another hour as Wizengamot members questioned the ethics, legality, and wisdom of Harry's placement. When Chief Warlock Crouch finally called for the vote on the motion of no confidence, the chamber fell silent with anticipation. "All those in favor of the motion of no confidence in Chief Warlock Dumbledore's guardianship decisions regarding Harry Potter?" Hands rose throughout the chamber, more than half of the voting members, including several who had historically been Dumbledore's strongest supporters. "All those opposed?" Additional hands rose, but it was immediately apparent that they constituted a smaller number. "All those abstaining?" A handful of members raised their hands, unwilling to choose sides in such a momentous decision. Chief Warlock Crouch consulted with the official tally keepers before announcing the results. The motion of no confidence receives 43 votes in favor, 38 votes opposed, and 6 abstentions. The motion fails to achieve the required 2/3 majority for passage. The chamber erupted in voices as members reacted to the narrow defeat of the motion. While Dumbledore had survived the vote, the margin was slim enough to constitute a severe challenge to his authority and judgment. However, Crouch continued, raising his voice over the commotion, "This body hereby institutes formal oversight protocols for any future placement of magical children in Muggle custody. No child shall be placed without comprehensive assessment, regular monitoring, and annual review by qualified magical social workers." As the Wizengamot session concluded, Amelia Bones gathered her evidence materials with mixed feelings. While they had failed to formally censure Dumbledore, they had fundamentally changed the magical world's approach to child protection. More importantly, they had sent a clear message that Harry Potter's welfare mattered more than institutional convenience or magical tradition. In the gallery, Narcissa Malfoy and Molly Weasley exchanged a brief nod of mutual respect before departing in opposite directions, their unlikely alliance having achieved its goal of forcing the magical world to confront its failures and commit to doing better. The magical government had faced its first major challenge to traditional authority structures and emerged changed, forced to acknowledge that even the most revered leaders could make catastrophic errors when the welfare of children was at stake. Chapter 12. A New Kind of Protection. Harry Potter sat in the garden of the Chen family home on a warm August morning, watching Mrs. Chen tend to flowers that shouldn't have existed, and Mr. Chen paint watercolors that glowed with impossible light, and realized for the first time in his life that adults were asking him what he wanted. Not what he needed, or what would be convenient for them, or what would cause the least trouble. What he wanted. The meeting that would determine his future was scheduled for that afternoon, and 3 weeks after his removal from Privet Drive, Harry found himself in the unprecedented position of having multiple adults competing to provide him with the best possible life. "Harry," Mrs. Chen called from where she was arranging the magical daisies into a bouquet for their kitchen table. "How are you feeling about today?" It was a question she asked him every morning, part of the gentle routine that had transformed his understanding of what family could mean. How was he feeling? When had anyone ever cared about his feelings before? "Nervous," Harry admitted, setting down the book he'd been pretending to read. "What if they make me go back?" Mrs. Chen set down her gardening shears and settled beside him on the grass, her presence immediately comforting in the way that had become as natural as breathing over the past 3 weeks. "Harry, look at me," she said gently. "Do you remember what I told you when you first came here?" "That I belonged here," Harry whispered. "That's right. And do you remember what I told Vernon Dursley when he came to our door? That I would never go back to his house." "Exactly. And Harry, I want you to understand something very important. Today's meeting isn't about whether you stay with us. Today's meeting is about making sure that staying with us is legal, safe, and permanent. The decision about where you belong has already been made." Harry felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. In 3 weeks with the Chen family, he had learned to trust their promises because they had never once failed to keep them. When Mrs. Chen said he would be safe, he was safe. When Mr. Chen promised to help him with his reading, the lessons appeared. When Emma said she would teach him to ride her old bicycle, she spent hours running beside him until he could manage on his own. "What about the strange things?" Harry asked. "What if they decide I'm too much trouble?" Mrs. Chen smiled, the expression that had welcomed him home every day since his arrival. "Harry, the strange things are part of who you are, and who you are is someone we love. If the adults at today's meeting can't accept that, then they don't understand what's most important." At 2:00 that afternoon, the conference room at Surrey County Council offices had been transformed into something resembling a peace negotiation between warring nations. Sarah Williams sat at one end of the polished table with legal documents, medical reports, and 3 weeks' worth of evidence documenting Harry's remarkable progress in foster care. At the other end, Albus Dumbledore sat with Professor McGonagall and a woman Harry had never seen before, who introduced herself as Mrs. Fig. Between them, Patricia and David Chen flanked Harry like protective guardians, their presence solid and reassuring in a room full of competing agendas and institutional authorities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the professional composure that had served her throughout the crisis. "We're here today to establish permanent arrangements for Harry Potter's care that serve his best interests while addressing the concerns of all parties involved." "Miss Williams," Dumbledore said quietly, "I believe we all share the same fundamental goal, ensuring Harry's safety and well-being. The question is how to achieve that goal while addressing certain unique circumstances that surround his situation." "Professor Dumbledore," Sarah replied, "I've reviewed the evidence presented at your Wizengamot hearing. I understand that Harry's background involves classified government matters. What I need to know is whether those matters require him to return to an abusive home." "No," McGonagall said firmly, before Dumbledore could respond. "They do not. In fact, the evidence suggests that Harry's emotional well-being is directly connected to the effectiveness of any protective measures we might implement." Harry found himself caught between confusion and hope as the adults discussed his life in terms he didn't fully understand. But gradually, through the careful negotiations and formal language, a picture began to emerge that seemed almost too wonderful to believe. "So let me ensure I understand the proposal correctly," Sarah said, reviewing her notes. Harry would remain in permanent guardianship with Mr. and Mrs. Chen, with full legal recognition of that arrangement through Surrey family courts. "Correct," Patricia Chen confirmed. "We've completed all the requirements for permanent guardianship. Harry is our son in every way that matters." Additionally, Dumbledore continued, Harry would receive supplemental education in specialized subjects to prepare him for his eventual enrollment in a particular boarding school that serves children with his unique background. And this supplemental education would be provided by Mrs. Figg would serve as Harry's official liaison and tutor, McGonagall explained. She has experience working with children from unusual circumstances and would ensure Harry's preparation for his future educational needs. Mrs. Figg, who had been quiet throughout most of the meeting, leaned forward slightly. "I would visit regularly to provide lessons and ensure Harry's comfort with both sides of his heritage. Think of it as bilingual education for someone who belongs to two different communities." Sarah made careful notes, her expression thoughtful. "And the financial arrangements for this care?" The Specialized Education Department would provide a generous stipend to the Chen family to offset any costs associated with Harry's unique needs, Dumbledore said. Additionally, Mrs. Figg's services would be fully funded, and Harry would have access to specialized medical care should any unusual situations arise. "What about the people who hurt him?" Harry asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the formal negotiations. "What happens to Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia?" Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "Harry, the Crown Prosecution Service has filed formal charges against Vernon and Petunia Dursley for child abuse, child endangerment, and violation of compulsory education requirements. They will face criminal proceedings regardless of today's arrangements." "They can never try to take you back," Patricia Chen added firmly. "The court order terminating their custody rights is permanent and irrevocable." Harry felt something he had never experienced before. The certainty that justice would be served. The people who had hurt him would face consequences. The people who loved him would keep him safe. And somehow, impossibly, both sides of his strange heritage would work together to protect rather than control him. "Harry," Sarah said gently, "do you understand what we're proposing? You would live permanently with Mr. and Mrs. Chen as your legal guardians. Mrs. Figg would visit regularly to help you learn about your special background and prepare for your future education, and both the Muggle legal system and the specialized authorities would work together to ensure your safety and well-being." Harry looked around the table at the adults who had spent 3 weeks negotiating on his behalf. Sarah Williams, who had risked her career to protect him. The Chen family, who had opened their home and hearts without reservation. Professor McGonagall, who had finally found the courage to challenge decisions she knew were wrong. Even Mrs. Figg, who apparently had been watching over him for years without his knowledge. "Do I get to stay with the Chens forever?" he asked. "Forever," Patricia Chen confirmed, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "You're our family now, Harry. Nothing will change that." "And I don't have to go back to the cupboard?" "Never," Sarah Williams said firmly. "That part of your life is over. And the strange things that happen around me, they're not bad." Mrs. Figg spoke up, her voice warm with understanding. "Harry, the strange things are part of what makes you special. There's a whole world of people who experience similar things, and someday you'll learn to understand and control them. But even if you couldn't, even if the strange things continued forever, you would still be loved and wanted and safe." For the first time in 9 years, Harry Potter believed that he deserved protection, love, and a future filled with possibilities rather than punishments. "I want to stay with the Chens," he said clearly. I want Mrs. Fig to teach me about the strange things, and I want to make sure no other children have to sleep in cupboards." The last statement surprised even Harry. He hadn't planned to say it. But sitting in that room, surrounded by adults who had fought to protect him, he found himself thinking about other children who might be trapped in situations like his, waiting for someone to notice, someone to care, someone to act. "Harry," Dumbledore said softly, "that's a very mature and admirable goal, and I believe the new oversight protocols that have been established will help ensure that other children receive better protection than you did." Sarah Williams gathered her paperwork with satisfaction, having achieved something unprecedented in her career, a custody arrangement that served a child's needs while bringing together two entirely different authority structures in cooperation rather than conflict. 6 weeks later, Harry Potter began his new life in earnest. His days were spent with the Chen family, attending the local primary school and learning what normal childhood felt like. His evenings were enriched by Mrs. Fig's visits, where he discovered that the magical world was vast, wonderful, and eager to welcome him when he was ready. The magical protections around the Chen household had stabilized into something remarkable. A home where love created its own powerful shields, where a child's happiness generated beauty and safety, where the impossible bloomed alongside the everyday in perfect harmony. And in the magical world's record books, a new precedent had been established, the first formal recognition of a Muggle family as guardians for a magical child, supported by both communities working together to ensure that protection meant safety, love, and the right to choose one's own future. Harry Potter had learned that he was not a burden to be hidden, a weapon to be controlled, or a symbol to be manipulated. He was simply a child who deserved love, safety, and the chance to grow into whoever he chose to become. For the first time in his life, that chance was genuinely his to take.